She was going to die out there, and she knew it. Clara Bennett pressed both hands against the wheels of her chair and pushed until her palms screamed and her shoulders shook and the mud sucked at the wheels like it was trying to swallow her whole. The rain came down in sheets so cold they felt like broken glass against her skin. She couldn't see the road anymore. She couldn't see anything. Just darkness and water and the sound of thunder rolling across the Montana plain like God himself was warning her to turn back. But there was nowhere to turn back to. She had been cast out of Millfield 3 days ago with nothing but a worn canvas bag, a pair of scissors, and the clothes on her back. The family she had worked for, the Hargroves, respectable people with a big house and a good name, had put her out like she was furniture they no longer needed. Mrs. Hargrove had stood in the doorway with her arms crossed and her face smooth as polished stone and said, "We can't have someone like you in this household anymore." You understand, don't you? Clara had understood. She'd understood that a woman in a wheelchair was an inconvenience, a liability, a thing to be pitied in public and despised in private. She had thanked them, God help her, and wheeled herself down the front path, while their housemaid watched from the upstairs window without lifting a finger. 3 days of roads and cold and strangers who looked through her like she was made of smoke. 3 days of asking at doors before she could finish her sentence. 3 days of sleeping in whatever shelter she could find, a church alcove, a wagon shed, a doorway that reeked of old leather and rot. And now this storm. Now this dark road that led nowhere she could name, and her arms were failing her, and the bag clutched against her chest held everything that was left of who she used to be: thread, needles, a small pair of shears, and a folded document she hadn't let go of in 2 years. A document that had nearly destroyed her. A document that could still destroy someone else entirely if she ever found the courage to use it. She felt the front wheel drop into a rut and the whole chair lurched sideways, and for one terrible second Clara thought it was over. She thought she was going over into the mud and she would just lie there in the Montana rain, and that would be the end of Clara Bennett. Seamstress nobody. Discarded woman. But she caught the armrest, dug her fingers in, righted herself. And through the darkness, maybe 100 yards ahead, she saw a light. Just one, warm and yellow in a single window. She stared at it for a long moment, breathing hard rain running down her face and into her mouth. She thought about what would happen if she knocked on that door and whoever lived there said no. She wasn't sure she had enough left in her to survive another no. But she pushed toward it anyway, because the alternative was the mud and the dark, and Clara Bennett had survived too much to let herself end in the mud. The knock, when it came, was barely audible above the storm. Nathan Cole had been sitting at his kitchen table for the better part of 2 hours, nursing the same cup of coffee gone cold, and staring at the account ledger he hadn't touched in a week. The numbers weren't going to change no matter how long he looked at them, but looking gave him something to do besides think. And thinking these days led places he didn't particularly want to go. He was 38 years old, and he lived alone on 12 acres of rocky Montana land that his father had left him, and most nights that was fine. Most nights he preferred the silence, but some nights like this one, when the storm pressed against the walls and the fire burned low and the house felt about 3 sizes too big for one man, some nights the silence had weight to it. He heard the knock and thought at first that it was the wind. Then it came again, soft, uncertain, like whoever was on the other side wasn't sure they had the right to be there. Nathan pushed back from the table, crossed the room, and opened the door. What he saw stopped him cold. A woman sat in a wheelchair on his porch. She was soaked through to the bone, her dress plastered to her skin, her dark hair hanging in dripping ropes around her face, her hands gripping the armrests of that chair with white-knuckled ferocity. She was holding a canvas bag against her chest, like it was the only solid thing left in her world. She looked up at him, and her eyes dark, exhausted, red-rimmed from cold or crying, or both met his, and she didn't say anything for a moment. She just looked at him the way a person looks at someone when they've already decided to accept whatever comes next. Then she opened her mouth. "I'm sorry," she said. Her voice came out rough and small. I'm sorry to bother you. I saw your light. She stopped. Tried again. I had nowhere else to go. Nathan Cole stood in his doorway and looked at this woman, this soaking, shaking, hollow-eyed woman in a wheelchair on his porch in the middle of a Montana storm, and he didn't think about the inconvenience. He didn't think about the talk it might cause. He didn't think about what his neighbors would say if they knew he'd let a strange woman into his house at midnight. He thought about the look on her face. He had seen that look before. Not on a woman's face on his own, in the mirror, in the months after Margaret left, and took everything good about this house with her. That look that said, I have been surviving so long I've forgotten what it feels like to just live. He stepped back from the door. Come inside, he said. No one should face a storm alone. Before we go any further, if this story is already pulling at your heart, I want to ask you to hit that subscribe button right now and turn on notifications so you never miss a story like this one. Drop a comment below and tell me what city or state you're watching from. I love seeing how far these stories travel. Now let's get back to Clara and Nathan, because what happens next is going to change everything. She didn't move right away. Nathan noticed the way she hesitated on the threshold, like she was waiting for the catch. Like she expected him to take back the invitation, or add a condition to it, or look down at the wheels of her chair and make some face that told her she'd misunderstood. He didn't do any of those things. He just waited. Finally, Clara pushed herself forward, and over the raised threshold, Nathan saw her compensate for it automatically. Her wrists angled just so, the chair tilting slightly, and into his kitchen. He closed the door behind her, and the sound of the storm dropped by half. She sat in the middle of his kitchen floor and dripped onto the floorboards and looked around with the careful, measuring eyes of someone cataloging exits. Nathan had seen that look too. It was the look of a person who had learned the hard way not to feel safe anywhere. I'll get you something dry, he said. You don't have to. I know I don't have to. He was already moving toward the chest at the far end of the hall. There's a towel on the hook by the door. Spare quilt in the chest. Coffee's cold, but I can put it on again. He heard her exhale. Not a sigh exactly, more like the sound a person makes when a tension they've been carrying for so long they forgot it was there finally, slightly loosens. Thank you, she very quietly. Don't mention it. He came back with a dry shirt of his own, the smallest one he had, which wasn't particularly small, and a pair of his wool socks and a thick flannel blanket. He set them on the table within her reach and turned his back, busy himself with the coffee. My name's Clara, she said. Clara Bennett. He didn't turn around yet. Gave her time to manage on her own. Where'd you come from, Miss Bennett? Pause. Millfield. 3 days east. 3 days. He did turn then because he couldn't help it. He looked at her arms, at the way the muscle ran in them. Ropey and developed in a way you didn't see on women who sat still and understood, without her having to explain it. What 3 days of pushing that chair across dirt roads and through creek crossings had cost her. You came from Millfield in this weather? The weather caught up with me, she said. There was something wry in it, a thin sliver of humor underneath all that exhaustion, and Nathan found himself almost smiling. Reckon it did. He set the coffee on the stove. You eat today? The pause before her answer told him everything. This morning, she said. I had some bread I'd kept from. She stopped. It doesn't matter. It matters. He opened the bread box, cut 2 thick slices, set the cast iron to heating. You'll eat before you sleep. He expected an argument. Women like her, women who'd been knocked down hard enough times, sometimes had trouble accepting straightforward kindness without looking for the angle. But Clara Bennett just nodded and wrapped the flannel blanket around her shoulders and watched him with those careful dark eyes. Why are you doing this? She asked. Nathan set the bread in the pan and listened to it hiss. You were in my doorway in the middle of a Montana storm. What would you have me do? Most people would have done nothing. Most people. He shrugged one shoulder. I ain't most people. She was quiet for a moment. He could feel her watching him. Neither am I, she finally said. She slept that night in his spare room, which hadn't been used since his younger brother visited 4 years back, and still smelled faintly of cedar and old wool. Nathan had cleared the threshold of the door as best he could with what he had wedged a book under the door to hold it flat, moved the low chest to the side. He hadn't made a fuss about it. He'd just done it, the same way he'd do anything else that needed doing around the property. He didn't sleep much himself. He sat by the kitchen fire until the storm began to ease, and the gray light of early morning started pressing through the window, and he thought about the way she'd looked at him when he opened the door. Not with hope exactly. With something more fragile than hope. With the last threadbare edge of it the look of a person who had made one final bid before giving up entirely. He'd seen enough people give up. He wasn't in the habit of contributing to it. In the morning he got up before her and built the fire back up and put fresh water to boil. He heard her moving in the spare room, the soft creak of wheels on the floorboards, the specific rhythm of someone managing their own space with practiced efficiency. When she came out, she had brushed her hair and straightened her dress and held herself with a dignity that had nothing to do with what she was sitting in. He poured her coffee without being asked and set it where she could reach it. "I'll be gone by afternoon," she said. "I don't want to be a burden." "You ain't a burden. You don't know that yet," he said. "But I know you need a day to rest those arms before you push another 12 miles in whatever direction you're headed." He sat down across from her. "Where are you headed, Miss Bennett?" She wrapped both hands around the coffee cup. Stared into it. "I'm not entirely sure." Nathan nodded slowly. "Then stay until you figure it out." She looked up at him. "You don't even know me. I know you knocked on a strange man's door in the middle of the night instead of sitting down the road and giving up," he said. "That tells me something." Clara Bennett looked at him for a long moment with those careful, measuring eyes. Then something in them shifted, not all the way, not enough to call it trust, but a crack in the wall. "A beginning. I can sew," she said. "I can cook, I can keep accounts, I can do laundry. I'm not looking for charity. I'll work for my keep." "I didn't ask you to." "I know," her chin came up slightly. "I'm telling you anyway." Nathan Cole picked up his own coffee and thought that there was more iron in this woman than in half the men he'd worked beside in his 38 years. He thought about the spare room and the empty house, and the cold silences that had a way of getting louder every winter. "All right," he said. "We'll figure it out as we go." The town of Harlow's Creek was not a big place. It had a general store, a livery stable, 2 competing churches whose congregations had not spoken directly to each other in 11 years, a barber shop, a land office that smelled like linseed oil and ambition, and a saloon that everyone pretended not to frequent and everyone frequented. It had exactly the number of people required for everyone to know everyone else's business before they knew it themselves. Word that Nathan Cole had taken in a strange woman reached the barber's chair before Clara had finished her second cup of coffee. He didn't hear about the talk right away. He only knew it was happening because of the way Roy Cutler looked at him when he came in to buy grain on the second day, that particular combination of curiosity and judgment that passed for conversation in small towns. "Heard you had some company come in on the storm," Roy said. "I did. Woman, they're saying." "That's right." Roy waited for more. Nathan didn't offer it. "She staying long?" "I couldn't say." Roy leaned on the counter and dropped his voice the way men did when they were about to say something they knew they shouldn't. "Nathan, you know people are going to talk." "People are already talking," Nathan said pleasantly. "Sounds like they started without me." He paid for his grain and left. But the talk didn't stop. It grew the way talk in small towns always grew, picking up detail and embellishment like a creek picking up silt. By the end of the first week, half of Harlow's Creek had decided that Clara Bennett was a con woman who'd targeted Nathan Cole because he was known to be solvent and known to be lonely. The other half couldn't decide whether she was a con woman or a charity case, and both options were equally satisfying to them. The women were the worst about it, which Nathan found darkly ironic. He'd have hoped that women would understand something about a woman who'd been put out with nothing. But the women of Harlow's Creek had built their social standing on the careful architecture of respectability. And a stranger in a wheelchair with no family and no name and no explanation was a threat to that architecture, whether they could have said exactly why or not. Eliza Marsh, who ran the women's prayer circle and had an opinion about everything, cornered Nathan outside the dry goods store on the 9th day. "Mr. Cole," she said, with the particular sweetness that meant she was about to say something cutting, "we've all been very concerned." "About what, Mrs. Marsh? About you?" She folded her hands at her waist. "It's very generous of you, taking in that poor creature. But you have to consider your reputation." Nathan looked at her steadily. "Reputation for what?" For she paused, recalibrated. "For good judgment. My judgment," Nathan said, "is that a woman who showed up on my porch in a storm needed food and shelter. I fail to see what my reputation has to do with that." Eliza Marsh's smile thinned. "She's a stranger, Mr. Cole. We don't know her people. We don't know why she left Millfield. There are stories." "What stories?" "Well," she lowered her voice, "they're saying in Millfield that she was let go from the Hargrove household. That she caused trouble. That she isn't the sort of woman a man in your position ought to associate with." Nathan Cole stood on the wooden sidewalk of Harlow's Creek's Main Street and looked at Eliza Marsh's small, satisfied face, and he thought about what Clara had looked like on his porch that first night. The shaking hands, the hollow eyes, the way she'd held that bag against her chest like it was the only thing anchoring her to the world. "Mrs. Marsh," he said, very evenly, "I don't put a great deal of stock in stories that come from people who put a woman out in a Montana winter with nothing but a canvas bag." He tipped his hat and walked away. Clara heard the talk eventually. She always did. It had a way of reaching her, carried on the current of small things. A look from the general storekeeper's wife when Nathan took her in on a supply run. A sudden quiet when she wheeled through a doorway. The particular quality of silence that follows a conversation that just stopped. She'd been navigating that silence for 2 years. She knew its texture by heart. "They're saying things," she told Nathan one evening. He was at the table working on the tack and she was sewing by the window where the last of the light was good, her needle moving with the kind of automatic precision that left her mind free to think. "In town." "I know," Nathan said without looking up. "About you. About your," chose the word carefully. "Your judgment." It bothers you?" He set down the leather he'd been working on and looked at her directly. "Does it bother you?" Clara held his gaze. "I've been the subject of talk for 2 years, Mr. Cole. It bothers me less than it used to." "Good." He picked the leather back up. "Then neither of us needs to waste time on it." She watched him for a moment. "You could make it easier on yourself. You could tell people I'm here temporarily. That I'll be moving on." "Are you moving on?" She looked back at her sewing. The needle caught the light and threw it off in a small, sharp arc. "I don't know yet." "Then I'm not going to say you are." He said it flatly, like it was obvious, like there was no other possible answer. "I don't lie to make other people comfortable, Miss Bennett." Never saw the sense in it. Clara pressed her lips together. She told herself the tightening in her chest was just the cold, or the strain of the day's work, or the ordinary ache that came from sitting in the same position for too long. She didn't quite believe herself. "Why did you really let me stay?" she asked. She'd been working up to the question for a week, and don't say because it was the right thing to do. "I know it was the right thing. I want to know why you did it." Nathan was quiet for a moment. The fire settled. Outside, somewhere in the dark, an owl called and was answered. "Because you looked like someone who'd been surviving so long you'd forgotten you were allowed to stop," he said. "And I know what that looks like. I've worn that face." Clara looked at him. He wasn't watching her. He was bent over his work, his big hands careful and deliberate on the leather. "What happened to you?" she asked. Very quietly. "That's a story for another night." He glanced up, just briefly, and there was something in his eyes, not pain exactly, but the place where pain had been and healed over hard. "You got enough of your own tonight." She nodded. She respected that. didn't push. But she thought about it later, lying in the cedar-smelling dark of the spare room, listening to the house settle around her. She thought about what it meant that a man with those kind of eyes had built himself a life that contained absolutely nothing soft. She thought that she understood him, in the specific way that people who've been broken by the same category of thing sometimes understand each other without explaining it. And she thought, not for the first time, and with the kind of alarm that came from knowing she shouldn't, that Nathan Cole was a far more dangerous thing than she'd expected. He wasn't dangerous because he was cruel, that she knew how to handle. He was dangerous because he was kind, and she had spent 2 years convincing herself she didn't need kindness anymore. The document was the thing she hadn't told him. She'd come close twice. Once when he'd asked about Millfield, and once when he'd asked why the Hargroves had turned her out. Both times she'd given him part of the truth: the accident, the years of recovery, the rumors, but not the whole of it. Not the letter she kept folded inside the lining of the canvas bag. Not the name on that letter. Not what it meant. She had found it 2 years ago, 3 weeks after the accident that had taken the use of her legs. She had been working in Hargrove's office, cataloging his correspondence, the way she always did when the letter had slipped from between 2 ledger books and fallen open on the floor in front of her. She'd read it before she understood what she was reading. And then she understood, and she wished she hadn't. Because the letter, written in Hargrove's own hand, addressed to the property overseer, made clear, in the dry, efficient language of a man who considered this a normal business matter, that the rotten staircase railing that had given way beneath Clara's weight had been reported to him 3 months before her accident. That he had known. That he had decided the cost of repair was not worth the trouble, because the servants used those stairs, and servants, unlike guests, were not his legal liability. The railing had given way. Clara had fallen 15 feet. And Edmund Hargrove had known it might happen and had done nothing. After the accident, he'd told the town that Clara had been careless. That she'd been warned about the stairs. That the family had, out of the goodness of their hearts, kept her on as long as they possibly could, but that here he'd chosen the word carefully. In a way that Clara had always found impressive in its cruelty, her limitations made her position untenable. The town had believed him. Why wouldn't they? He was Edmund Hargrove. And Clara had the letter, but she had nothing else. No witnesses, no money, no name that mattered. She had survived on seamstress work and charity, and the ironed determination not to let it break her. She had moved from town to town as the rumors followed her, because Hargrove's reach was longer than she'd understood, his family connections running through the whole region like roots through soil. Every time she started to put down the smallest root, something would shift and she'd find herself turned out again. Until Harlow's Creek, until a storm in a porch and a man who'd opened his door without asking what she deserved. She didn't know yet what to do with the letter. She only knew she wasn't going to do anything with it alone. She'd been alone with it for 2 years. She knew what that cost. In the 3rd week, she started sewing for the town. Nathan had mentioned, carefully and without pushing, that the wife of the land office clerk had been looking for someone to do alterations. Clara had let the comment sit for 2 days before she brought it up herself and said that if he wanted to mention her name, she didn't object. She had expected grudging acceptance, if anything. What she got was Margaret Albright, the clerk's wife, appearing at the ranch door with a bundle of garments, 2 dresses she wanted altered and a wedding shirt she wanted monogrammed, and a manner that was businesslike and neutral in a way that Clara recognized with some surprise as simple respect. "Nathan says you're good," Margaret said. "I am," Clara said. No apology in it. No hedge. She'd learned in 2 years that hedging just gave people permission to devalue you. Margaret looked at her for a moment, not the way most people looked at her, cataloging what was wrong, tallying up the liability, but the way a practical woman looked at someone she was considering doing business with. "Fair enough," Margaret said. "I'll need them back by the end of the month. You'll have them in 2 weeks." They shook hands at the door, and Margaret left. And Clara sat in the patch of afternoon sunlight that fell through the window and held the bundle of garments in her lap, and felt not happiness exactly, but the first clear note of something she'd nearly forgotten: purpose. Nathan found her like that an hour later, still in the sunlight, the fabric sorted and laid out across her sewing table, the needle already moving. He didn't say anything. He just made a sound in his throat that could have meant a lot of things and went to start supper. But Clara had heard the tone under the silence. She'd gotten good at reading Nathan Cole in the weeks she'd been here, at understanding the language he spoke when he wasn't speaking. And what that silence said was something like good. Just that. Just good. She bent her head over her sewing and told herself firmly that the warmth in her chest was just the fire. 2 more women came the following week. Then a third. Word traveled the way it always did in Harlow's Creek, through the specific network of women's talk, which moved faster and covered more ground than any telegraph Nathan could have sent. Not all the talk was hostile. Some of it was. Still, Eliza Marsh had not warmed to Clara and gave no sign of warming. But some of it was simply the recognition that a woman who could do this standard of work at this price was useful. And usefulness was something even suspicious women understood. Clara worked. She worked the way she always had, with total precision and no wasted motion, her body angled slightly to the left to catch the best light. Her needle finding its pace within the first few minutes of sitting down and not slowing until she made herself stop. It was the one place in her life where the wheelchair was irrelevant. When her hands were moving, she was just a seamstress. She was just work and skill and the quiet satisfaction of making something right. Nathan watched this happen and said nothing about it. But he noticed she saw him noticing, and what she saw in his face when he thought she wasn't looking was not pity. Was not patronizing pride, the kind of look people gave you when they expected less and you exceeded it. It was something simpler and harder to dismiss than that. He looked at her the way a man looked at something he hadn't expected to find, something that fit in a space he'd thought was empty. Clara told herself that was not her business. She told herself it firmly twice and then went back to her sewing and tried to mean it. "You moved the kitchen shelves," she said one morning. She'd come in and reached up for the coffee tin and found it within reach, without the full extension that had been awkward since the second day. She'd noticed other things too. Over the past week, the way the path from the spare room to the kitchen had been subtly cleared. A low chest moved, a corner of rug turned back so the wheels didn't catch. Small adjustments, practical ones, done without comment and without ceremony. Nathan poured himself coffee and didn't look at her. "I noticed you were reaching. You didn't have to do that." "I didn't do it because I had to, Nathan." She waited until he looked at her. "Why did you do it?" He held his coffee cup and looked at her with that straight, unflinching gaze that she'd stopped being unnerved by somewhere in the second week. "Because you're here," he said. "And this is your house too, while you're here. Seems right that you should be able to reach the coffee." Clara looked at him. He looked back. "You are a very strange man," she said finally. Something moved at the corner of his mouth, almost a smile. "So I've been told." She picked up her coffee and wheeled back toward the window in the morning light and the day's first length of fabric waiting for her needle, and she told herself again, more firmly than before, that the thing expanding in her chest like a plant turning toward the sun had nothing to do with Nathan Cole. She was lying to herself. She knew she was lying to herself. But she wasn't ready to stop, not yet, because if she stopped lying to herself, she would have to reckon with the fact that somewhere in these weeks of borrowed shelter and lowered shelves and plain-spoken kindness, she had begun to feel, despite everything she knew about how quickly that feeling could be taken away, something that terrified her in its sweetness. She had begun to feel like she was somewhere she might be allowed to stay. The morning Clara found the note tucked under her sewing basket, she almost missed it. It was small, folded twice, the handwriting cramped and hurried, like whoever wrote it had been afraid of being seen. She unfolded it slowly and read it twice, and then set it face down on the table and sat very still for a long moment. It said, "We know who you are. Leave before you bring trouble on a good man who doesn't deserve it." No signature. Of course no signature. She sat there with her needle halfway through a length of blue wool and the note face down beside her hand, and she thought about the 2 years behind her. The towns, the doors, the particular flavor of hostility that dressed itself up as concern. She thought about how Eliza Marsh had looked at her outside the general store on Tuesday, that thin-lipped, satisfied look of a woman who believed she was protecting something. She thought about Nathan, and then she folded the note back up, tucked it into the canvas bag beside the other document she carried, and picked up her needle. She was not going to run again, not this time, not from this. Nathan found out about the note 3 days later, and not from Clara. He found out because Roy Cutler's wife mentioned it in passing, while Roy was helping him mend the east fence mentioned it, the way women in Harlow's Creek mentioned things they weren't supposed to know. Wrapped in the gauze of casual conversation, so thin you could see straight through it. Heard someone left a message for your house guest. Doris Cutler called from where she'd brought them water. Down at the seamstress table, Nathan straightened slowly. What kind of message? Doris had the grace to look slightly uncomfortable. I couldn't say. I only heard there was one. Nathan drove the next fence post without speaking. Roy didn't push him, which was the thing Nathan appreciated most about Roy Cutler. The man knew when silence was the right answer. That evening, Nathan came in and sat down at the table while Clara was finishing the last of the alterations for Margaret Albright. And he said, without preamble, "Someone left you a note." Clara's needle didn't stop moving. Yes, you were going to tell me? She glanced up at him. Her face was composed, but he'd learned her face well enough by now to see the thing underneath the composure, the careful management of it, the effort. I wasn't sure it was your concern, Clara. He said her name quietly, but with enough weight that she stopped sewing. What did it say? She looked at him for a moment. Then she set down her work, crossed to the canvas bag, and handed him the folded paper. He read it once, his jaw tightened, he read it again. Then he set it on the table and looked at her with eyes that had gone very still and very flat in the way she'd come to recognize as Nathan Cole, at his most controlled, and therefore she'd learned, at his most dangerous. Who do you think sent this? He said. I have some ideas. Possibly. Or someone she put up to it. Clara folded her hands in her lap. It doesn't matter who sent it. What matters is what I'm going to do about it. And what are you going to do about it? Nothing, she said. I'm going to finish Margaret's alterations and start on the Hendersons' wedding order and do nothing about it. Nathan stared at her. That's your plan? That's the plan that kept me alive for 2 years, mister. Cole, there was no bitterness in it, just fact, delivered straight and level. The people who want me gone are hoping I'll react. They're hoping I'll make a scene or cause trouble, or give them a reason to point at me and say, see, we were right about her. I'm not going to give them that. He was quiet for a moment. Watching her. You've done this before, he said, not a question. She met his gaze. In Millfield. In Crestwood, in Dalton. Every town I've tried to stay in, there comes a point where someone decides I'm too much trouble and starts working to push me out. I know the pattern, she paused. I'm just tired of running when the pattern starts. Nathan looked at the note on the table. Something moved through his expression, something complicated and dark that she didn't entirely understand. You should have told me, he said. Why? So you could go confront Eliza Marsh and make it worse. No. He looked at her directly. So you didn't have to carry it alone for 3 days. Clara opened her mouth, closed it. She hadn't expected that. You don't have to manage everything by yourself here, Nathan said. He stopped. Started again. I know you've had to. I know that's how you survived. But you're not alone here, Clara. That's what I need you to understand. She looked at him for a long time. You're making this very difficult, she said finally, very quietly. What am I making difficult? Not. She stopped. Looked away. Out the window, where the last of the evening light was going amber. Not trusting you. Nathan didn't move, didn't speak. But something in him shifted. She felt it across the distance between them. subtle as a change in air pressure before a storm. "That's all right," he said just as quietly. "Take whatever time you need." The Henderson wedding order was for 12 garments wedding dress, a suit, 6 matching dresses for the bride's sisters, and 4 kerchiefs to be monogrammed with the family name. It was the biggest single order Clara had taken in 2 years, and when Beth Henderson had come out to the ranch to discuss it, she'd looked at Clara's work spread across the sewing table and said, with the blunt frankness of a farm woman who valued results over ceremony, "You're the best seamstress I've seen this side of Billings." "Can you do it in 6 weeks?" 4, Clara had said. Beth Henderson had smiled, startled. 4? 4 weeks. They'll be right. They shook hands across the sewing table, and Beth left with a lightness in her step that made Clara's chest do something complicated. She'd never had someone look at her like that, like her capability was simply a fact to be used and compensated for, no qualifier attached. Nathan, who had been pretending to read his account ledger in the corner, waited until the sound of Beth's wagon faded before he looked up. 4 weeks, he said. "I'm fast, I know you are." He paused. "You do know the Hendersons are one of the oldest families in Harlow's Creek." "I assumed. You do their wedding right, and there isn't a woman in this town who'll be able to ignore your work." Clara picked up her measuring notes and began calculating yardage. "I'm not doing it to change their minds, Mr. Cole. I'm doing it because Beth Henderson needs 12 garments and she's paying me a fair price." Nathan said nothing for a moment. "Nathan," he said. She looked up. "What, just Nathan? You've been here 5 weeks." He held her gaze steadily. "Mr. Cole is what strangers call me." Clara held his gaze for 1 beat, 2, 3. "Nathan," she said, trying it out. 2-syllable. It sat differently in her mouth than she'd expected. He nodded once, like it was settled, and went back to his ledger. She went back to her yardage calculation and absolutely did not smile. It was a Tuesday when the first man from Hargrove's network rode into Harlow's Creek. Clara didn't see him arrive. She heard about it from Margaret Albright, who came in that afternoon with a dress that needed letting out and a look on her face that mixed concern with the suppressed excitement of someone who had genuine news. "There's a man asking about you," Margaret said, settling into the chair Nathan kept near the sewing table for visitors. Over at the land office. Clara's needle paused, just for a heartbeat. Then it kept moving. The suit and smooth talk sort. Margaret set her hands in her lap. "James Whitmore," he told Roy, "said he's from a law firm in Helena. Said he's looking for a woman named Clara Bennett on behalf of a client." On behalf of a client. Clara knew which client. There was only one client it could be. "What did Roy tell him?" she said. Her voice was entirely level. "Roy said he didn't know any Clara Bennett." Margaret paused. "Which wasn't entirely untrue, since you came in on Nathan's account, not your own. But Roy came and told me, and I thought you ought to know." Clara set down her work and looked at Margaret Albright, at the frank, practical face of a woman who'd made a deliberate choice about whose side she was on and was owning it with no drama. "Why are you telling me?" Clara asked. "Because I've had 12 garments from you, and they're all perfect," Margaret said simply. "And because whatever this man wants, it doesn't look like good news for you, and you've had enough bad news." Clara was quiet for a moment. Then, "Thank you, Margaret." "Don't thank me. Just be careful." She told Nathan that night. He listened without interrupting, which she'd come to expect from him, that still, total attention he gave to things that mattered. When she finished, he sat back in his chair and was quiet for a long moment. "Hargrove sent him," he said. "Almost certainly. What does Hargrove want?" Clara looked at her hands. "There's something I haven't told you." "The room was very quiet, I know," Nathan said. She looked up sharply. "Not the specifics," he said. "But I've known since the second week that you're carrying something you haven't put down yet. Something bigger than just the accident." He held her gaze. "I didn't push because I figured you'd tell me when you were ready. But if this man is here, I think maybe you need to be ready now." Clara looked at him for a long moment, then she went to the canvas bag and took out the letter. She'd never handed it to anyone before, never trusted anyone enough. She held it for a moment, feeling the familiar weight of it, the 2 years of carrying it alone, and then she crossed the room and put it in Nathan Cole's hands. He read it slowly. She watched his face. She saw the moment he understood. The way his eyes stilled, the way the line of his jaw changed. He read it again. When he finally looked up at her, there was something in his face that she hadn't seen there before. Not anger, though the anger was there. Something underneath the anger. Something that looked, if she wasn't mistaken, like a man who had just been given a reason to fight. He knew, Nathan said yes. He knew about the railing and he let you fall anyway. Yes. And then he destroyed your reputation to protect himself. Yes. Nathan set the letter down on the table very carefully, the way a man set something down when he was working very hard not to put his fist through the nearest wall. And this man in the land office, he said. He's here because Hargrove knows you have this letter. He's been trying to find me for 2 years. I think he finally traced me here. Clara kept her voice steady. It was an effort. He'll offer money first. That's how Hargrove operates. He'll send this Whitmore with a sum and a very politely worded agreement that I sign over anything I know and leave the territory. And if you refuse, she met Nathan's gaze, then it gets less polite. Nathan stood up from the table. He went to the window. Stood there with his back to her, very still, and she could see the tension in the line of his shoulders, the particular tension of a man choosing between the safe answer and the right one. She braced herself. She'd been here before. This was the moment every time, when the person she'd trusted decided that the trouble she brought was not worth what she offered. She kept her face neutral. She was ready. Nathan turned around. Where are the witnesses? He said. Clara blinked. What? The other workers. The ones who were there when the conditions were reported. The ones Hargrove mistreated. He came back to the table. Sat down. Looked at her directly, with that straight, unblinking gaze that she'd stopped being able to dismiss. You can't make this stick with just the letter, Clara. You need people who saw what you saw, who know what you know. Where are they? She stared at him. You're not. She stopped. Start it again. You understand what this means. If we go after Hargrove, if we make this formal, if we bring witnesses and documents, he will come after you. He'll come after your ranch, your credit, your name. He has the money and the connections to make your life very difficult. I know. Nathan, Clara. He leaned forward, both forearms on the table, and his voice was absolutely level. I know what it costs. I'm asking you where the witnesses are. She looked at him, at this man who had opened a door in a storm, who had lowered shelves and cleared thresholds and sat across from her in the evenings, in a silence that had gradually become the most comfortable thing she'd known in years. She thought about the note someone had tucked under her sewing basket. Leave before you bring trouble on a good man who doesn't deserve it. She thought about the fact that she had stayed anyway. There's a woman named Patience Greer, she said slowly. She was the kitchen supervisor at Hargrove's property. She saw the report come in about the railing. She watched Hargrove read it and set it aside. Clara paused. She left his employ 2 months after my accident. Last I heard, she was in a town called Redfield, 60 miles northwest. Anyone else? 2 men from the grounds crew. Silas Drum and a man everyone called Dutch. I don't know Dutch's real name. Silas wrote to me once, 6 months after the accident. He wanted me to know. Her voice tightened slightly. She smoothed it out. He wanted me to know that he'd told people the truth and no one had listened. Because Hargrove got to them first. Because Hargrove got to them first. Nathan sat back. He was thinking she could see it, the way he processed things, methodical and unhurried, like a man who understood that good decisions took the time they took, and rushing them cost more than waiting. I'll ride to Redfield, he said, week after next, when the Henderson order's finished. She stopped. You'd do that? You'd ride 60 miles to find you've never met to ask her to testify against one of the most powerful men in the territory? If she was there and she saw it, yes. He said it like it was obvious. like there was no other answer. Why the word came out harder than she intended. More urgent. Nathan, why would you do this? What is any of this to you? He looked at her. For a long moment, he just looked at her. And then he said quietly, and without any decoration, because it's the right thing. And because you're not carrying this alone anymore. Clara looked at him and felt something crack open in her chest, something she'd spent 2 years sealing shut, mortaring over every time it started to give way. She felt it give way now and she couldn't stop it, and for one terrible moment she thought she was going to cry, which she absolutely refused to do, so she looked down at her hands instead and breathed through it until the worst of it passed. When she looked up, Nathan was still watching her. "You can't do this for me," she said. "I'm not doing it for you," he said. "I'm doing it with you. There's a difference." The next morning, James Whitmore came to the ranch. Clara heard the horse on the path and looked out the window and saw him the suit and smooth talk sort, just as Margaret had said. He was maybe 50, heavyset, with the kind of professional pleasantness on his face that long practice had made second nature. He dismounted at the gate with the ease of a man who believed himself to be managing a routine matter. Nathan was already at the door. Whitmore came up the path and stopped a few feet from the porch. "Mr. Cole? I'm James Whitmore, representing the Hargrove family of Millfield." "I was hoping to speak with I know who you're hoping to speak with," Nathan said. Whitmore adjusted his expression by a fraction, a man recalibrating. "Then you know why I'm here. I've got a fair idea. Mr. Cole, I want to assure you that my client simply wants to resolve a misunderstanding." "A misunderstanding," Nathan repeated. "A situation," Whitmore amended smoothly, "that's been allowed to persist longer than necessary. My client is prepared to be very generous in finding a resolution." Clara had wheeled herself to the doorway. She stopped there, within the frame of the door but not through it, and when Whitmore saw her, his expression went through 3 careful adjustments in the space of a second: surprise, recovery, professional pleasantness reasserted. "Miss Bennett, I'm glad I found you. I've been looking for some time." "I know," she said. "My client is prepared to offer you a very reasonable—" "No," Whitmore paused. "You haven't heard the offer." "I don't need to." She held his gaze from the doorway. "I know what the offer is. Money and silence. I'm not interested in either." Whitmore looked from Clara to Nathan and back again with the calculating expression of a man totaling up variables. "Miss Bennett, I'd encourage you to think carefully. You've been through a great deal already. My client simply wants this matter put behind everyone." "A fresh start. A fresh start," Clara said. "Is that what he wants?" "He's prepared to be very generous. He can keep his generosity." Her voice was flat and clear. "He knew about that railing for 3 months. He chose not to fix it. He chose not to warn anyone. And when I fell, chose to destroy name rather than admit what he'd done." She kept her gaze on Whitmore's face and watched him work very hard to keep his expression neutral. "I don't want his money. I want people to know what he did." Whitmore was quiet for a moment. The professional pleasantness was still there on his face, but underneath it now she could see the other thing, the hint of what came next, when the pleasant approach didn't work. "Miss Bennett," he said, and his voice had dropped half a register, "you need to understand that what you're proposing, making accusations against a man of my client's standing, carries significant risks for you. And for anyone associated with you." Nathan stepped off the porch. He moved quietly. He always moved quietly, but there was something in the way he came to stand at the gate, facing Whitmore, that had the quality of a door closing. "I want you to listen to me carefully," Nathan said. "You came to my property and you've spoken your piece. You've made your offer and you've made your implied threat. Now I'm going to speak mine." He stood very still, his voice completely even. "If anything happens to this woman, if her reputation takes another hit, if any pressure comes on her business, if so much as a letter shows up that smells like it came from your client, I will take that letter she's been carrying, and I will put it in the hands of every magistrate, every newspaper, and every cattle association from here to Helena. And then we'll see how much of my client's standing survives the winter. You understand me? Whitmore held his gaze for a moment. 2 moments. Then he adjusted his hat. Good day, Mr. Cole, he said pleasantly. He mounted his horse and rode back down the path without another word. Nathan watched until he was out of sight. Then he turned back to the porch, where Clara sat in the doorway with her hands folded in her lap and an expression on her face that he couldn't entirely read. You just made yourself a target, she said. I know it. You didn't need to do that. I did, actually. He came back up onto the porch. Stopped a foot from her, close enough that she had to tilt her head to hold his gaze. You've been alone with this for 2 years. You've been carrying it by yourself and fighting it by yourself and getting pushed out of town by it every time you got anywhere. That ends here. Clara looked up at him. Why, she said, and this time it wasn't a challenge. It was something smaller and more honest than a challenge. It was a question she was actually asking, from somewhere she'd kept locked for 2 very long years. Because some things are worth standing up for, Nathan said. And because he stopped. Started again, more careful. Because I think you're one of them. That night, Clara couldn't sleep. She lay in the dark of the cedar-smelling spare room and listened to the house settle, and she thought about Whitmore's face when Nathan had spoken. The way the man's professional composure had stayed intact right up until it didn't, that flicker, just for a second, of a man who had expected an easier problem and found himself facing something solid instead. She thought about the letter in the canvas bag. 2 years she'd carried it. 2 years she'd told herself she was waiting for the right moment, the right circumstances, the right position from which to use it. And she'd half believed herself. But lying in the dark now, she had to be honest with herself the way you could only be honest in the dark. She hadn't been waiting for the right moment. She'd been afraid. And she'd been afraid, and there was no shame in that alone. And afraid was a reasonable response to her situation, but she needed to stop pretending it was strategy. She wasn't alone anymore. The thought arrived quietly and settled in her chest with a weight that was entirely different from the weight of the letter. She wasn't alone anymore, and Nathan Cole had just stood at his gate and looked a corporate lawyer in the eye and told him that what happened to Clara Bennett was his business. Not as charity, not as protection in the condescending sense. As partnership, as the decision of a person who'd looked at another person and said, your fight is worth fighting, and I am going to help you fight it. She thought about what it would mean to trust that. She'd trusted people before. She'd trusted the Hargroves. In the beginning, trusted that her competence would be recognized, that her work would be valued, that the people who employed her would treat her with basic human decency. She knew what it had cost her when that trust broke. But Nathan was not Edmund Hargrove. Nathan was. She tried to find the word for what Nathan was, in the dark and the quiet, and the word she landed on surprised her with its simplicity. Nathan was good, not perfect. Not uncomplicated. He was lonely in a way that ran deep, and she suspected the story of how he'd gotten that way was not a comfortable one. He was stubborn and economical with words to the point of bluntness, and he had a temper she'd seen the edges of twice without seeing it break loose, which told her he'd worked hard to control it. But underneath all of that, good, the kind of good that didn't announce itself. The kind that just did the thing, lowered the shelves, stepped off the porch, stood at the gate. The kind that said, you're not carrying this alone anymore. She closed her eyes. She thought about Patience Greer in Redfield, 60 miles northwest. She thought about Silas Drum somewhere, who had tried to tell the truth and hadn't been heard. She thought about the wedding dress she had 3 more weeks of work on, and the women of Harlow's Creek who were starting, grudgingly and then less grudgingly, to acknowledge that the work coming out of Nathan Cole's ranch was exceptional. She thought about the note in the canvas bag and the letter beside it, and the 2 years of carrying them both through the dark. And she made a decision, not a small, careful, provisional decision of the sort she'd been making for 2 years, the kind designed to be easy to take back if things went wrong. A real decision, the kind you made when you stopped protecting yourself from disappointment and just chose, flatly and with full knowledge of the risk, what you were going to do. She was going to stay, not because she had nowhere else to go. That had been true once, but it wasn't anymore. Margaret Albright would give her a recommendation. The Henderson family would follow. She had enough of a reputation now, even in these few weeks, to build something somewhere if she needed to. She was going to stay because this was where she wanted to be. Because Nathan Cole was worth the risk of wanting something. Because for the first time in 2 years, she had looked at a place and thought this could be home. The next morning she was at the sewing table before Nathan came down. When he walked into the kitchen and saw her there already working, needle moving, the Henderson wedding dress spread across the table, catching the early light, he stopped in the doorway for a moment. "You're up early," he said. "I'm always up early." He moved to the stove without commenting, poured 2 cups without asking. "Thank you," she said. "For the coffee?" "For yesterday." Nathan sat down with his own cup. "You don't have to keep thanking me. I want to." She kept her eyes on her work. "I want to tell you something else too." "All right." "I've been thinking about what you said. About Patience Greer. About the witnesses." Her needle kept moving. "I think you're right. I think if we're going to do this, if we're going to do it properly, we need to do it soon. Before Whitmore goes back to Hargrove, and they decide that polite didn't work and try something else." "I was thinking the same thing. I'd like to write a letter to Silas Drum. I still have his address. It's 2 years old, but it might find him." She paused. "And I think we should tell Roy. Roy knows everyone in this region. If Dutch is anywhere within 100 miles, Roy will know how to find him." Nathan looked at her over the rim of his cup. "You've been planning this all night." "I've been thinking about it. Clara." He waited until she looked up. "Are you sure? Once we put this in motion, there's no clean way back." She met his gaze. "I stopped looking for clean ways back the night I knocked on your door," she said. "I'm done running, Nathan. I want to stand still long enough to fight." Something moved through Nathan Cole's face. Something she'd never seen there before, through all the weeks of quiet and shared evenings and small kindnesses. Something that broke through the careful, maintained surface of him and was visible for just a moment before he caught it. It looked, she thought, like hope. "All right," he said. His voice was steady. "Then we fight." She nodded and looked back at her sewing. Outside, Harlow's Creek was waking up in the ordinary way, horses and voices and the distant clang of the blacksmith's hammer, the world turning on its unremarkable axis. Inside the ranch house, 2 people sat on opposite sides of a table with their coffee going warm between them, and something had shifted in the air between them, quiet and irrevocable, the way shifts like that always happened, not with drama, but with the small absolute certainty of a door closing on one room and opening on another. Neither of them named it, but it was there, and it was, Clara thought, bending her head over the white silk of the Henderson wedding dress, the most terrifying and most necessary thing she had felt in 2 years. Silas Drum's letter arrived on a Wednesday 9 days after Clara sent hers. She was at the sewing table when Nathan brought it in from the post, and she knew from the weight of it, the thickness, that it was more than a brief reply. She set down her needle and took it from his hand and opened it carefully, the way you opened something you'd been waiting for and were half afraid of at the same time. Nathan sat down across from her and waited. She read it once. Then she looked up. "He's coming," she said. Nathan went very still. "To Harlow's Creek? He says he's been waiting 2 years for someone to do something." Her voice was not entirely steady. "He says he told his wife the night of my accident that someday someone would have to answer for it." He says she stopped, cleared her throat. "He says he's been carrying his own letter. A statement he wrote down 6 months afterward, everything he witnessed, signed and dated. He kept it because he didn't know what else to do with the truth." Nathan leaned forward. "He has a written statement. Dated 2 years ago, before anyone could accuse him of fabricating it to suit a current argument." She folded the letter carefully. Her hands were steady now. "He'll be here in 10 days. Nathan sat back, and something moved through face, that look she'd seen the morning she told him she was done running. That thing that looked like hope taking up more space than it was used to. What about Dutch, he said. He mentions Dutch. His name is Harold Vandermeer. He left the territory after the accident, went to Wyoming, Silas thinks. But Silas knows a man who might know where. Clara set the letter in the canvas bag beside the other document. And he mentions someone else, a woman named Lucy Carr who worked in Hargrove's household accounts. She saw the maintenance ledger. The one that would show the railing repair was requested and never approved. Nathan was quiet for a moment. A maintenance ledger, he said. That's not just a letter. That's a financial record. If it still exists, if Hargrove hasn't destroyed it. He may not have thought to, Clara said. He may have believed that putting me out and ruining my name was sufficient. He's been very confident for 2 years that I had no way to fight back. She paused. He may have underestimated what 2 years of having nothing to lose does to a person. Nathan looked at her across the table. He definitely underestimated that, he said. Roy Cutler found Dutch, or rather, found a man who'd worked alongside Dutch in Wyoming and knew where Vandermeer had ended up in less than a week. Roy had the geographic knowledge of a man who'd spent 30 years trading and dealing across 4 territories. And when Nathan put the question to him, Roy had thought for maybe 4 seconds and then said, Vandermeer. Harold. Yeah, I think I know who you're after. Got a cousin in Casper who'd know for certain. Nathan didn't ask Roy for details. Roy didn't ask Nathan for explanations. That was the architecture of male friendship in Harlow's Creek. You did what was needed, and you didn't make it complicated. But 3 days later, when Roy came back with a town and a name and an approximate address, he did pause at the gate and look at Nathan with the direct, unvarnished expression of a man who'd decided something. You know what you're doing is going to make enemies, Roy said. Hargrove's got reach. I know it. He's connected to the Pendleton Land Trust. Which means he's connected to half the development money coming into this territory. Roy turned his hat in his hands. People with money don't like being exposed, Nathan. They push back hard, that too. Roy looked at him for a moment. Then he nodded, slow and final, like he'd asked his question and gotten his answer, and the answer satisfied him. All right, Roy said, I'll ride to Casper myself if you need me to. Nathan looked at his friend, at this plain-faced, steady man who'd said yes before he'd been asked, and felt something shift in his chest that he didn't have easy words for. I might take you up on that, he said. You know where to find me. Roy settled his hat back on his head. And Nathan, you might want to talk to Thomas Aldridge before this goes much further. Thomas Aldridge was Harlow's Creek's only lawyer. Clara went with Nathan to see Aldridge. She'd insisted on that, and Nathan hadn't argued, which she appreciated. She'd half expected him to suggest she stay at the ranch to make the gentlemanly, well-intentioned error of trying to shield her from the difficult conversation. He hadn't. He'd simply said, I'll hitch the wagon, and that had been that. Aldridge's office smelled like every lawyer's office Clara had ever been in, paper and ink and the particular dusty authority of stacked books. He was a small, precise man in his mid-50s who wore his skepticism openly, which Clara found she respected more than false warmth. He read the letter. He read it twice. Then he set it on his desk and looked at Clara over his spectacles with the expression of a man recalculating a sum that had come out differently than expected. Where did you get this? He said. Hargrove's files. It fell from between 2 ledger books, and you've had it for 2 years.
Yes.
And you've never attempted to use it. I had no resources and no witnesses. A single letter from a woman in a wheelchair with a destroyed reputation and no money. She held his gaze. I know enough about how these things work, Mr. Aldridge, to know when the time is right. He studied her for a moment. And you believe the time is right now. I have a witness coming with a signed, dated, written statement. I have 2 more witnesses who can be located. I have reason to believe a financial ledger exists that corroborates the letter. She paused. And I have someone willing to stand beside me. She didn't look at Nathan when she said it. She didn't need to. Aldridge leaned back in his chair and steepled his fingers and spent 30 seconds thinking in silence. Edmund Hargrove, Millfield. The family with the property trust. The same. He's connected to Judge Whitfield and Helena. I assumed he would be, which means we can't go through Helena channels. We'd need to go to the Territorial Circuit Court, which means finding a judge who isn't already in Hargrove's pocket, which takes time. Aldridge picked up the letter again, looked at it with the focused attention of a man reading for specific legal weight. But this, if it's authenticated, this is not nothing, Miss Bennett. This is a man in his own hand acknowledging knowledge of a hazardous condition. Combined with a witness statement and a financial record, he set the letter down. Combined with all of that, this becomes a case. Clara felt the air in the room change. Something had been suspended waiting, and now it began to move. "Can you take it?" she said. Aldridge looked at her. Then at Nathan. Then back at Clara. "I've been practicing law in this territory for 22 years, he said. I've watched men like Hargrove buy their way out of consequences for 22 years. He picked up the letter one more time. "Yes," he said, "I'll take it." That night, Nathan found Clara sitting outside. She'd wheeled herself to the edge of the porch where the planking ended and the yard began, and she was sitting in the dark without a lamp, just sitting in the quiet with her hands in her lap and her face tilted up at the sky. He stood in the doorway for a moment before she heard him. "You should be sleeping," he said. "So should you." He came out and sat on the porch step beside her, close enough to talk without raising his voice. The night was clear and cold and full of stars, the kind of Montana sky that made the world feel very large and the human problems in it very small, which was either comforting or terrifying depending on your disposition. "How are you doing?" he asked. Clara was quiet for a moment. "I'm not sure," she said. "I've been trying to answer that question for the last 2 hours." "You don't have to have it figured out." "I know." She was quiet again. "Then I keep thinking about Aldridge's face when he read that letter. The way he looked at it, like it was real, like it's something that could actually do something." She paused. "I've been carrying that letter for 2 years, and I've shown it to exactly no one, because every time I thought about showing it, I thought, who's going to believe me? A woman with no money, no family, no name. Sitting in a wheelchair in whatever town would have me." Her voice stayed level throughout this. It was one of the things he'd come to understand about her, the way she said the hardest things the most quietly. And now there's a lawyer who looked at it and said case. "It is a case. It is," she agreed. And then softer, I need a minute to believe it." Nathan nodded. He understood that. The distance between knowing a thing was true and actually believing it in the place where belief lived, he'd learned that gap personally. You could know something completely and still need time to let it become real. "Silas gets here in 7 days, he said. "I know. And then we'll have what we need to move forward." "I know." She turned to look at him. In the starlight, her face was quiet and serious, and very beautiful in the way that faces were beautiful when they were entirely themselves, no performance in them. "Nathan, what happened to you? The thing you said you'd tell me another night." She held his gaze. "I think I'd like to know." He looked back at her. The question sat between them without pressure. She'd asked it before and respected his silence, and she was asking again now, not to push, but because she was offering something. He understood. She was offering the real kind of knowing, the kind that came from showing the difficult things, not just the manageable ones. He was quiet for a moment. "Her name was Margaret," he said. "I don't mean Doris Cutler's Margaret, a different Margaret. I was going to marry her." He looked out at the dark yard. It was understood between us for 3 years. I was building this place, saving, getting it to a point where I felt like I had something to offer. He stopped. Started again. She married someone else, a man from Helena with money and an established name. She didn't tell me she was thinking about it. One day she was the woman I was going to marry, and the next day I heard she'd gone to Helena and come back with a husband. Clara was quiet. She wasn't cruel about it, Nathan said. She wasn't that kind of woman. She just made a practical decision. And I think she told herself that I'd understand, eventually, that it was practical. That there was no cruelty in choosing the better option. His voice stayed even throughout this. And I did understand. I understood completely. That was almost the worst part. That you couldn't even be properly angry, Clara said quietly. He looked at her. Exactly that. You understood her reasons, and it didn't make it hurt less. No, he said. Clara looked at him. How long ago? 6 years. And you built all of this, she gestured, encompassing the ranch, the house, the years of solitary work. You built all of this alone. After, it gave me something to do. She was quiet for a moment. I think you also convinced yourself you preferred it, she said. The alone. I think you worked at it until you almost believed it. He held her gaze. Almost, he agreed. The words sat between them. Neither of them moved. Nathan, Clara said very quietly. I know, he said, just I know. She looked at him for one long moment. Then she reached out and put her hand over his, where it rested on the step between them. She didn't say anything else. He didn't either. They sat like that for a while in the Montana dark, with the stars overhead, and 7 days until Silas Drum arrived and the whole fragile, necessary thing they were building still half-constructed and uncertain. It was enough. For tonight it was exactly enough. Silas Drum arrived on a Thursday, which was market day in Harlow's Creek, which meant half the town saw him come in. He was a big man, broad across the shoulders, with the kind of weathered face that came from years of outdoor labor, and hands that looked like they'd been built for gripping things and holding on. He rode a brown horse that was sensible rather than pretty, and he came into town with the deliberate, unhurried manner of a man who had made his decision and was not second-guessing it. Clara was at the general store when he arrived. She saw him pull up at the livery stable and ask directions, and she watched the livery boy point toward Nathan's ranch, and she felt something move through her chest that was part relief and part terror in equal measure. He was real. He was here. This was happening. She turned her chair and headed back to the ranch faster than was dignified, and she didn't care. Nathan was already at the gate when Silas Drum rode up, and by the time Clara came up the path from the other direction, the two men were already shaking hands with the particular directness of men who'd been briefed on each other and decided on first principles whether to trust. Silas saw Clara and his face did something complicated. He took his hat off. He said, "You look well. Better than last time you saw me, I imagine," she said. A ghost of a smile crossed his weathered face. Considerably. They went inside. Nathan put coffee on. Silas sat across from Clara at the table and set his hat on his knee, and looked at her with the steady, direct eyes of a man who had something he needed to say and had been waiting 2 years to say it. "I'm sorry," he said. "I should have done something sooner. I told my wife, I told her the night it happened that it wasn't right. That someone ought to say something. But Hargrove ran those properties like he stopped. There wasn't a man working for him who didn't have something he could threaten. Some debt, some obligation, some family connection he could squeeze. I had 3 kids and a wife and a mortgage I'd taken out against next year's wages." His jaw tightened. "That's not an excuse. I want you to know I know it's not an excuse." Clara looked at him across the table. "It's a reason," she said. "I know the difference." He let out a breath, like he'd been holding it for a while. "I wrote it all down," he said. He reached into his coat and produced a folded document heavier than the letter Clara carried. More pages. "Everything I saw, every conversation I heard, the date the maintenance report came in, who delivered it, who signed for it. The date I saw Hargrove read it, what he said it on the table. I had my wife's brother witness my signature. He's a deacon. His signature means something in a courtroom." Clara looked at the document. Then she looked at Silas Drum. "Why did you keep it?" she said. "For 2 years, with everything Hargrove could have done to you, if he'd found it, why did you keep it?" Silas looked at her steadily. "Because you fell 15 feet, he said simply. And I watched it happen, and I knew why it happened. And I thought if I let myself throw that paper away, I'm letting myself throw away what I know, and that's not a thing I can live with." He picked up his coffee. "I'm a plain man, Miss Bennett. I don't have a lot of fancy philosophy. But I know wrong from right and I know which side I'm on. Clara pressed her lips together. She nodded. Thank you, Silas, she said. Don't thank me yet. We haven't won anything. No, she agreed. But we're going to. The certainty in her own voice surprised her, just slightly. The same way it always surprised her when she realized she'd crossed some invisible line from hoping to knowing. Aldridge met with Silas the next morning and came out of the meeting with the focused, rapid energy of a man who'd been handed better material than he'd expected. The statement is airtight, he told Nathan and Clara that afternoon. The dates, the specificity, this isn't a general account. This is chapter and verse. Combined with the letter, we have knowledge, negligence, and concealment. He set his papers on the desk. What we still need is the ledger, or someone who can testify to having seen it. Lucy Carr said, Can you locate her? Silas thinks she went to Butte. He has a name, a cousin she spoke of once. We could write. Right, Aldridge said immediately, today. And we need to move on Vandermeer. If Harold Vandermeer can corroborate the maintenance report, that gives us a third independent witness. He looked at both of them. I want to file this within 6 weeks, before Hargrove has time to get ahead of it. We have the element of surprise right now, and I want to use it. 6 weeks, Nathan said. No. Nathan looked at Clara. We'll have what you need. The problem started the following week. It began small, or rather it began in the way that Hargrove-related problems always began with Clara, which was small and deniable, and designed to make you doubt your own perception before you could identify the source. 3 of her regular customers canceled orders in the same week. Not dramatically, no confrontations, no explanations. Just messages delivered through third parties. One said she decided to wait. One said her circumstances had changed. One didn't offer a reason at all. Clara noticed the pattern immediately. Whitmore's been back, she told Nathan that evening. Nathan set down his fork. You're sure? 3 cancellations in a week. After 2 months of consistent business, she kept her voice even. Someone's been talking to my customers, reminding them of the stories from Millfield. Maybe adding new ones. This is how it starts. The work dries up, the reputation goes, and then staying becomes difficult to justify. You're not leaving. I know I'm not leaving. She held his gaze. But I need you to understand what we're dealing with. Hargrove doesn't fight directly. He works through other people. He makes situations, and then he stands back and watches them play out, and by the time you can prove anything, the damage is done. Nathan was quiet for a moment. Beth Henderson, he said. What about her? Has she canceled? No. Has she said anything? Clara paused. She came in 2 days ago to check on the wedding dress. She didn't mention canceling. Clara stopped. Thought back. She said something odd. She said, Don't let the noise worry you. I didn't know what she meant at the time. Beth Henderson knows what's happening, Nathan said. And she's still coming. He pushed back from the table. I'm going to talk to Roy, Nathan. This isn't a fight. We can win by sitting still, Clara. He stood up. Hargrove's playing his game. We play ours. She watched him put on his coat. What are you going to do? He looked at her. Same thing he does, he said. Talk to people. The difference is I'm going to tell them the truth. Nathan spent the next 3 days talking. He talked to Roy, who talked to the Hendersons and the Albright family, and 4 other families who'd done business with Nathan for years. He talked to the men at the livery stable, and the grain merchant, and the 2 brothers who ran the cattle operation east of his property line. He didn't make speeches. He didn't ask for favors. He just told the facts plainly, without embellishment, in the way that Nathan Cole told all things, and let people do what they would with them. What most of them did was listen. What several of them did, after listening, was send word to their wives that the orders they'd placed with the seamstress at Cole's ranch ought to stay placed. 2 of the canceled orders came back. The 3rd didn't. But 2 out of 3 was not nothing, and then Beth Henderson did something that Clara hadn't anticipated and wouldn't have asked for in 10 years of planning. She wore one of Clara's dresses to the church social. Not the wedding dress that was still in progress. An everyday dress, one Beth had ordered 6 weeks ago in deep green wool with hand-stitched detail at the collar and cuffs. She wore it to the church social where Eliza Marsh presided over the refreshment table. And when 3 women asked her where she'd gotten it, she said, clearly and without lowering her voice, Clara Bennett made it. The seamstress at Nathan Cole's ranch. She's the finest needlework I've seen in this part of Montana. Clara found this out from Margaret Albright, who had been standing close enough to hear. Eliza's face, Margaret said, with a satisfaction she didn't try to hide, was something to see. Clara looked at the dress she was currently working on, the Henderson wedding dress, 3/4 complete. The silk bodice pinned and shaped and ready for the final seaming, and felt something she'd been carefully not feeling for weeks, because it felt too fragile to acknowledge. She felt safe, not permanently, not without condition. But right now in this room, with this work under her hands and this town beginning to rearrange itself in ways she hadn't dared to hope for, right now she felt it. She let herself feel it for exactly 10 seconds. Then she picked up her needle and got back to work. The letter from Lucy Carr arrived on a Friday morning, and it was not what any of them had hoped for. Aldridge read it aloud in his office while Nathan and Clara sat across from him and Silas Drum stood by the window with his arms folded. Lucy Carr had found work in Butte. She had a new life. She was sorry, she said. Genuinely sorry. She knew what had happened to Miss Bennett was wrong. She thought about it still. But she had a child now and a position she couldn't afford to lose, and she was afraid of what Hargrove could do to her if she spoke up, and she hoped they would understand. Aldridge folded the letter. The office was very quiet. She's afraid, Clara said. She is, Aldridge agreed. Can we compel her testimony? Nathan asked. Technically, through the circuit court, yes. But compelling a frightened witness rarely produces useful testimony. Aldridge set the letter aside. She'll say she doesn't remember clearly. She'll say it was all so long ago. She'll be technically present and functionally useless. Silas spoke from the window. The ledger itself. If we had the actual ledger, not just testimony about it, would that change things? It would change everything, Aldridge said. A financial record of the maintenance request being received and declined is direct documentary evidence. It doesn't need a witness to interpret it. Then we need the ledger, Clara said. The ledger is on Hargrove's property in Millfield, Nathan said. If it still exists, if he hasn't destroyed it. He may not have. Clara was thinking, the way she thought when she was working through a problem still, focused, her hands quiet in her lap. His accountant, a man named Gerald Morse, was meticulous. Every record went into the ledgers and every ledger was archived. Hargrove prided himself on complete financial records. It was a point of professional vanity with him. She paused. Gerald Moore's not loyal to Hargrove out of love. He was loyal because Hargrove paid extremely well. But Gerald Morse had a professional code. He wouldn't have destroyed a financial record any more than he would have forged one. You think the ledger is still there, Nathan said. I think if Gerald Morse is still Hargrove's accountant, the ledger is still there. Silas turned from the window. I know Gerald Morse, he said. Everyone looked at him. We worked at the same property for 7 years, Silas said. He's a private man. Keeps himself to himself. But he's honest. Genuinely honest, the kind of man who works for someone dishonest because the work itself is honorable, if that makes sense. He paused. We were never close, but we respected each other. Could you write to him? I could. Silas was quiet for a moment. I can't promise he'd respond, or that he'd be willing to. I'm not asking him to testify, Clara said. She was very calm. This was the calm she recognized in herself, the calm that came not from ease but from total clarity of purpose. I'm asking him to preserve the record, not to bring it forward. Not to expose himself, just to not let it disappear. Silas looked looked at her for a long moment. That, he said slowly, he might be willing to do. Whitmore came back on a Wednesday. This time he didn't come to the ranch. He went directly to Aldridge's office, which told Nathan, who heard about it from Roy within the hour, because there were no secrets in Harlow's Creek that moved slower than Roy Cutler's network, that Hargrove knew they'd engaged a lawyer. Which meant Hargrove's people had been watching. Which meant the window of surprise Aldridge had wanted to use was narrowing. Nathan went to find Aldridge that afternoon. He offered to settle, Aldridge said. He didn't sit down. He stood behind his desk with his hands flat on the surface in a way that suggested he'd been pacing before Nathan came in. Significant money. A signed agreement from Hargrove acknowledging vaguely, without admitting specific liability, that Miss Bennett had suffered due to conditions on his property. That's not what we want, I told him that. What did Whitmore say? Aldridge looked at him directly. He said that his client had documents of his own. That there were aspects of Miss Bennett's time in Millfield that had not yet been made public. And that if we pressed forward, those aspects would be. Nathan stood very still, he said. He didn't specify. He was careful not to specify. Aldridge came around the desk. Nathan, I need you to understand what this means. Hargrove is going to manufacture something, or find something, anything that he can use to muddy the water. To make this about Miss Bennett's character rather than his conduct. He already destroyed her reputation once, and he'll do it again if he can. With more resources and more motivation this time. Aldridge held his gaze. I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly. Is there anything in Miss Bennett's past, anything at all, however small, that Hargrove could twist into something damaging? Nathan thought about Clara. He thought about the 2 years of moving from town to town, of fighting to survive, of doing whatever her skill and her determination could provide. He thought about the things she'd told him, and the things she'd implied, and the things that lived in the careful, guarded spaces she hadn't opened to him yet. I don't know, he said honestly, but I'm going to ask her. He told her that night. He told her directly, without softening it. Because Clara Bennett was not a woman who benefited from softening, and she would have seen through it instantly anyway. He told her what Whitmore had said, and he watched her face and he waited. What he saw was not panic. What he saw was something he recognized, the look of a person cataloging, assessing, moving quickly through memory with the practiced efficiency of someone who has spent a long time thinking about what might be used against them. He'll try to say I stole the letter, she said. Her voice was quiet and rapid. That I took it from Hargrove's files without permission. That I broke into private correspondence, did you? He said it without judgment. It fell out of a ledger. She met his gaze. I was cataloging the correspondence file. It was mixed in with papers I was legitimately handling. Fell. She paused. I could have put it back. But you didn't. No apology, just fact. I took it because I understood what it was. That could be presented as theft of private correspondence. I know, she was quiet for a moment. There's something else he might use. In Crestwood, the second town after Millfield, there was a dispute about payment. A family claimed I'd charged them for work I hadn't completed. It wasn't true, but I couldn't prove it, and I left rather than fight it, because I didn't have the standing or the resources. She looked at her hands. He could find that. Dress it up as a pattern. Call it fraud. Nathan sat down across from her. Is there anything else? She met his gaze. The honesty in her face was complete and a little painful to look at, the kind of honesty that cost something. Nothing real, she said. But Hargrove doesn't need real. He needs plausible. He needs enough smoke to make people wonder if there's fire. Aldridge knows that, Nathan said. He's preparing for it. Nathan. She looked at him with an expression he hadn't seen on her before, not uncertainty exactly, but something close to it. Something that showed the edges of her confidence. If this gets bad, if he comes after you in this your ranch, your credit. Clara, I need to say this, all right, say it. If the cost of fighting this becomes your life, your property, your name, I need you to tell me. I need you to promise me you'll tell me." She held his gaze with a directness that had the quality of a demand, not a plea. "Because I will not let you lose everything you built for a fight that belongs to me." Nathan looked at her for a long time. "It stopped belonging only to you," he said, "the day you handed me that letter." She opened her mouth. "I'm not being noble, Clara. I'm being accurate." He leaned forward. "This is my fight too. What Hargrove did, what men like Hargrove do it, doesn't just hurt the people they hurt directly. It poisons the ground. It tells everyone watching that power protects itself, and truth doesn't matter, and if you fall, life will alone." He paused. "I spent 6 years building a life on 12 acres of Montana rock, and I was very comfortable in it, and I was also, if I'm being honest, waiting for a reason to give a damn about something beyond my fence line." He held her gaze. "You gave me that reason, and I am not giving it back." Clara looked at him. Something in her face that last held back, defended, sealed off thing cracked. Not broke. Cracked, a fault line opening in something that had been under enormous pressure for a very long time. She didn't cry. She wouldn't let herself cry. But her eyes went bright, and her jaw set, and she looked at him with a fierceness that was one of the most alive things Nathan Cole had ever seen. "All right," she said. Her voice was rough at the edges. "Then we finish this. We do." Outside, the Montana night was cold and clear and indifferent, the way nature was always indifferent to the small, enormous dramas of human lives. But inside that kitchen, something had been decided, not today, not in this single conversation, but through all the weeks and documents and late evenings and hands held in the dark and truths, told without softening. Something had been built. Piece by careful piece, between two people who had both been broken and had both chosen not to stay that way. And in Millfield, in a filing room that smelled of old paper and linseed oil, Gerald Morse sat at his desk in the failing evening light and read the letter Silas Drum had sent him, and he sat with it for a long time. Then he opened his filing cabinet. He found the maintenance ledger from 2 years back, found it exactly where it always was, because Gerald Morse was a meticulous man and things in his system did not go missing. He sat and looked at it. He thought about the entry on the 4th page. The one that recorded a maintenance report, received, reviewed, declined. Initialed by Edmund Hargrove himself, in the small, precise script of a man who signed everything and believed that paperwork protected him. Gerald Morse was not a brave man. He'd never claimed to be. He was an accountant. His world was numbers and records, and the honest representation of what had actually occurred. He closed the ledger. He did not put it back in the filing cabinet. He set it on the corner of his desk, where it would stay until he decided what to do with his honesty. Gerald Morse arrived in Harlow's Creek on a Tuesday morning without warning anyone. He came by stage, not on horseback, which told Nathan, who saw him climb down at the stage stop, with a leather satchel held against his chest, and the look of a man who had made a decision that scared him and was seeing it through anyway. That this was not a man accustomed to hard travel. He was slight, 50 or so, with wire-rimmed spectacles and the careful, precise movements of someone who measured everything twice before committing. Nathan didn't know who he was until the man walked directly up to him outside the general store and said, "Mr. Cole, my name is Gerald Morse. I believe you know why I'm here." Nathan went very still. "I know Silas Drum wrote to you," he said. He did. Morse adjusted his grip on the satchel. "I want to speak with Miss Bennett." "And with your lawyer. Does Hargrove know you're here?" Morse's mouth tightened. "Not yet. He will, eventually." These things don't stay hidden. He met Nathan's gaze with the direct, slightly desperate look of a man who had gotten this far on nerve and wasn't sure how much he had left. "I'd like to move quickly, if that's possible." Nathan looked at the satchel. At the way Morse held it. "Is that the ledger?" he said. Morse looked down at the satchel as if he'd briefly forgotten he was holding it. "It is," he said quietly, "among other things." They gathered in Aldridge's office. Within the hour, Nathan, Clara, Aldridge, Silas Drum, and Gerald Morse, who sat in the chair closest to the door and set the satchel on his knees and spent 30 seconds looking at Clara before he spoke. I owe you an apology, Morse said. Clara looked at him steadily. You don't know me, Mr. Morse. I know what happened to you. I knew within a week of your accident what the maintenance ledger showed. I knew what Hargrove had done. He held her gaze and I stayed. I kept his books and filed his records and told myself that an accountant's job was to record what happened, not to judge it. His jaw was tight. I've been telling myself that for 2 years. I'm not sure I believe it anymore. The office was very quiet. What Clara said. Silas's letter. Morse paused. And the fact that Whitmore came to my office 3 days ago. Aldridge sat forward. Whitmore came to see you? He told me, very suddenly, very carefully, that if any financial records from Hargrove's property found their way into the wrong hands, it would constitute a serious breach of professional ethics. Possibly criminal. Morse's mouth twisted. He was threatening me. Politely. The way Hargrove's people always did things politely. He reached into the satchel. I decided that if he was worried enough about the ledger to threaten me, then the ledger was worth more than my comfort. He set a book on Aldridge's desk. It was bound in brown cloth, ordinary looking, the kind of record book that sat in every business office in the territory. Aldridge opened it with the careful hands of a man handling something that might break if rushed. He turned to a page that Morse indicated with one precise finger. Aldridge read. Page 43, Morse said. The entry dated March the 8th. Maintenance report received, reviewed, declined. Initialed E.H. He paused. Page 44, 2 weeks later. Second maintenance report on the same railing, same notation. Same initials, a second report, Nathan said. The grounds crew submitted it twice, Morse said. They were sufficiently concerned that they filed it again. He looked at Clara. He received 2 warnings, Miss Bennett. Not one. He declined both. The room absorbed this in silence. Clara sat with her hands folded in her lap and said nothing for a moment. When she spoke, her voice was entirely level, which Nathan had come to understand was not the absence of feeling, but the presence of a great deal of it, held under the kind of control that came from years of practice. 2 warnings, she said. He read them both. He initialed them both, which is how his system worked. Initialing meant he had reviewed the item. Morse's voice was dry and precise. Edmund Hargrove was a meticulous man about his paperwork. He would not have appreciated the irony. Clara looked at the ledger on Aldridge's desk. She looked at it for a long time. How do we use this, she said. Aldridge explained it quickly, with the focused energy of a man who had been waiting for this exact piece. The letter proved knowledge, the ledger proved knowledge twice over, and with Hargrove's own initials. Silas Drum's statement proved what had been seen and heard. Together they formed a chain of documentation that went from the maintenance report to Hargrove's desk to the railing to Clara's fall, every link visible and dated and signed. I'm going to file with the circuit court in Bozeman, Aldridge said. Judge Harlan Pryor. He's not Hargrove's man, he's from the Eastern Bench. No connection to the Helena network. He looked at each person in the room in turn. This will take 3 to 4 weeks to move through the preliminary process. During that time, Hargrove will know what's coming. He will fight it. I need all of you to understand that the next month will not be comfortable. What will he do? Silas asked. Everything he can. He'll challenge the ledger's provenance. Aldridge looked at Morse. He'll claim it was removed without authorization. He'll challenge your standing to bring it forward. Morse had anticipated this. I prepared a document, he said. He reached into the satchel again and produced a folded paper. A voluntary disclosure statement. I am identifying myself as a witness to the maintenance process and voluntarily producing records relevant to an active legal claim. My ethics board will still investigate me, but voluntary disclosure is a different matter from theft, legally. You'll likely lose your position, Aldridge said. I've been Hargrove's accountant for 12 years, Morse said. I think I can find other work. He said it quietly, without drama, the way a man said something he'd spent 3 days making peace with. I'd prefer to be able to look at myself in the morning. Nathan looked at this small, precise man who had come by stage across hard country, with a leather satchel held against his chest, and felt something he recognized as genuine respect. "Thank you," Nathan said. Morse looked at him. "Don't thank me. I'm 12 years too late." The next 3 weeks moved with the grinding, anxious pace of waiting for something to break. Hargrove's response came faster than any of them had expected. It didn't come through Whitmore this time. It came through 3 men Nathan didn't recognize who arrived at the ranch on a Thursday morning before the sun was fully up. Nathan heard the horses on the path and was out the door before they reached the gate. He stood on the porch with his arms loose at his sides and watched them come. 3 men on good horses, expensive horses, the kind that cost money and were meant to communicate that money was behind them. The one in front was maybe 40, with a flat, professionally expressionless face. "Mr. Cole," he said, "we represent the Hargrove family's legal interests. We're here to inform you that a complaint has been filed with the Territorial Land Office alleging irregularities in the original survey of your property." Nathan kept his face still. "What irregularity?" "The eastern boundary of your 12 acres. There's a claim that it was surveyed incorrectly 30 years ago, and that approximately 2 acres of your current property fall within a land grant held by a company associated with our client's family trust." The coldness that moved through Nathan's chest was specific and familiar, the coldness of a threat that had found exactly the right target. "2 acres of my east pasture," he said, "approximately." The man's voice was pleasant. "It's likely a simple administrative error. These things can usually be resolved very quietly." "And the resolution," Nathan said, "involves what, exactly?" "A reversion of the disputed parcels, and separately, a withdrawal of certain legal proceedings currently being contemplated against our client." The man held his gaze. "As I said, these things can usually be resolved quietly, without anyone losing anything significant." Nathan stood on his porch in the early morning light and looked at these 3 men on their expensive horses and felt the full weight of what was happening. This was the thing Aldridge had warned him about. This was Hargrove doing what he did, working sideways. Not directly, coming at the person standing beside Clara rather than at Clara herself, because he'd learned that coming at Clara directly hadn't worked. He thought about what Clara had said to him. "I need you to promise me you'll tell me if the cost becomes your life." He thought about what he'd told her. "It stopped belonging only to you the day you handed me that letter." "Tell your client," Nathan said, "that if his survey claim has merit, the courts will sort it out. And tell him that I said no man who uses land law as a weapon in place of an honest argument deserves to keep the land he's already got." He looked at the man in front levelly. "Are we finished?" The man looked at him for a moment. "We'll be in touch, Mr. Cole. I imagine you will," Nathan said. He stood there until they rode back down the path and out of sight. Then he went inside and sat down at the table and put both hands flat on the surface and breathed for a moment. Clara was in the doorway of the sewing room. She had heard everything from the window. He could see it in her face, not fear, but the particular intensity of someone who has just watched something happen on their account. "The east pasture," she said. "It's a pressure tactic. The survey records are 30 years old, and this claim has never been raised because it isn't real." He kept his voice steady. "Aldridge will know how to handle it, Nathan." "Clara." He looked at her. "I knew this was coming. Not this exactly, but something like this. You told me he'd come sideways, and I believed you." "I'm not surprised." He held her gaze. "I'm not going to pretend it doesn't concern me. The east pasture is my best grazing land, but I'm not going to let that change anything either." She looked at him for a long moment. The thing in her expression was complicated and layered, and he didn't try to read all of it. "You should have told me before you turned them away," she said finally. "Would you have wanted me to call you out to the porch to negotiate with them?" Pause. "No," she admitted. "Then I made the right call." She was quiet. "I hate this," she said. "I hate that he can reach you through your own land." "He can try to reach me," Nathan said. "He hasn't reached anything yet." Aldridge's response to the survey claim was swift and withering. He filed a request for the original survey records the same afternoon Nathan told him, and by the following morning he had three things: the original land patent issued to Nathan's father, a county record confirming the boundary survey from 28 years prior. And this was the piece that made Aldridge's eyes sharpen: a note in the county archive indicating that the specific parcel cited in Hargrove's complaint had been reviewed and confirmed 6 years ago in an unrelated boundary dispute with a neighbor to the north. The claim was already adjudicated, Aldridge said flatly. Not formally, it was resolved through the county office without reaching a court, but there is a record. Hargrove's people either didn't find it or hoped we wouldn't. He set the papers down. This claim dies in preliminary review. He knows that. Which means this was purely harassment designed to cost you time and money and worry, not to actually succeed. Can we use that? Nathan asked. The fact that it was fabricated. Aldridge considered. It strengthens our argument about the pattern of his conduct. A man who responds to a legitimate legal claim by fabricating a property complaint against the opposing party is demonstrating exactly the kind of behavior we're alleging. He paused. I'm going to add it to the filing. For the first time in the weeks since this had started, Aldridge allowed himself something approaching satisfaction. He's making our case for us, he said. Every time he pushes, he's showing the court exactly what kind of man he is. The town had been watching all of this. Harlow's Creek was small enough that you could not conduct a legal battle in it without the entire population forming opinions, and opinions in small towns had a way of becoming very loud very fast. For the first 3 weeks, the town had been divided more or less along the lines it usually divided: the established families cautious, the working people more sympathetic, Eliza Marsh's circle firmly opposed to the whole enterprise. But then two things happened that shifted the balance. The first was that the Henderson wedding took place, and Beth Henderson wore a dress that Clara had made in 4 weeks from silk that had arrived late and thread that kept breaking at a critical moment, and the dress was perfect. It was by every account the most beautiful wedding dress Harlow's Creek had seen in 20 years. It fit as if it had grown there. The needlework at the cuffs and collar was so precise that 3 women got down on their knees in the church to look at it more closely. Beth Henderson walked down the aisle in it, with her chin up and her face shining, and when the pastor asked who gave this woman, her father said the right words in a voice thick with feeling. And not a single person in that church was thinking about Clara Bennett's wheelchair, or her legal battle, or the rumors that had followed her from Millfield. They were thinking about the dress. They were thinking that whoever had made that dress had hands that deserved respect. The second thing that happened was that Harold Vandermeer Dutch arrived in Harlow's Creek on a Friday afternoon, and Roy Cutler brought him directly to Nathan's ranch. And he sat across from Clara at the table where she'd been sitting the night she'd handed Nathan the letter, and he told them a story they hadn't heard before. Dutch was a big man, like Silas, but where Silas had the steady quality of someone who'd processed his guilt and arrived at resolution, Dutch had the tightly wound look of a person who'd been carrying a weight he hadn't fully named yet. I left Hargrove's employ the month after Miss Bennett's accident, he said. He kept his eyes on the table rather than on Clara. I told myself I left because the work was done and I'd found better. That was partially true. He looked up. But the real reason was that I couldn't look at the east staircase anymore. I couldn't walk past it and see where the railing used to be and not think about. He stopped. His jaw worked. Mr. Vandermeer, Clara said quietly. It's all right. It's not all right, ma'am. His voice was rough. I was on the grounds crew that submitted the first maintenance report. I wrote it. My handwriting's on it. He looked at her directly, and what was in his face was the raw, difficult expression of a person who had been avoiding this moment for 2 years and could not avoid it anymore. I wrote the report and filed it and figured it'd get handled the way things got handled. I didn't follow up. I should have followed up. He paused. When it didn't get fixed and nothing happened, I should have pushed harder. Told someone, made noise. He stopped. I didn't, and then you fell. The room was very quiet. You were one man in a system designed to ignore reports like yours, Clara said. Her voice was kind but direct. You did what you were supposed to do. You filed the report. I should have done more. Yes, Clara said. But you're here now. Something in Dutch's expression broke slightly, and he nodded once, hard, like he was nailing something down. I'll testify to anything you need, he said. The report. What it said when I filed it. What happened after. He paused. And there's one more thing. Something I didn't think mattered at the time, but he reached into his coat and produced a single folded piece of paper. A copy of the original report. I kept one for myself when I filed the official one. I don't know why I kept it. Habit, maybe. My father always said keep a copy of everything you sign your name to. He set it on the table. Same date as the one in the ledger. Same wording. My signature. Aldridge, who had come over when Roy's message reached him, picked up the paper and read it and set it down with the same careful hands he used for everything that mattered. This is corroboration, he said. His signature here and in the ledger's maintenance record, it authenticates the ledger entry. Dutch looked at Clara. Will it help? Clara looked at the paper. At the careful handwriting of a man who had held onto a single page for 2 years for reasons even he couldn't fully articulate, and who had brought it across the territory because Silas Drum had sent a letter and a good man had asked. Yes, she said. It will help. The filing reached Judge Pryor in Bozeman on a Wednesday. Aldridge had sent it by the fastest available rider, a young man named Cooper, who regularly carried urgent documents for the county and who made the ride in under 2 days. By Thursday evening, Aldridge had a confirmation of receipt. By Friday, they had something more, a message from Judge Pryor's clerk, indicating that a preliminary hearing had been scheduled for the following month. Aldridge came to the ranch with the message and read it aloud, and then looked at all of them: Nathan, Clara, Silas, Dutch, Morse, who had stayed in Harlow's Creek because he had nowhere pressing to be and had found, somewhat to his own surprise, that he didn't want to leave, and said, "We're past the threshold. This is going to court." Nathan watched Clara's face. He watched her take in those words, going to court, and he watched what happened underneath the composed surface of her. The slight tightening around her eyes, the way her hands gripped the armrests of her chair for just a second before they relaxed. The breath she drew that was fractionally longer than usual. She had been waiting for this for 2 years, and now it was real. And real was always different from waiting, in ways that were sometimes harder and sometimes better and always more. When? 5 weeks, Aldridge said. We'll need to travel to Bozeman. All of us. The hearing itself could take 2 to 3 days. Hargrove will be there, Silas said. His lawyers will be. Whether he attends himself, Aldridge paused. Men like Hargrove often prefer to let their representation do the work. It keeps them insulated. But given the nature of the evidence against him, his lawyers may advise him to appear and present a human face. What does that mean for us? Dutch asked. It means Clara may have to sit across a room from him, Nathan said. He said it directly and without softening, because Clara would have recognized softening and resented it, and because they all needed to know what this was going to require. Everyone in the room looked at Clara. She looked back at them with the particular steadiness of a woman who had been through more than most people in that room could imagine and had come out the other side of all of it, still choosing to stand in whatever way was available to her and face what came next. Good, she said. I've had things I wanted to say to that man for 2 years. The week before the hearing, the letter arrived. Nathan found it in the Morning Post and recognized immediately that it was different from the other correspondence, not official, not legal, not stamped by a firm or an office. The handwriting was neat and educated and belonged, he found when he turned to the signature, to a woman named Lucy Carr. He brought it inside and handed it to Clara. She read it twice. He watched her. She set it down. She was very still for a moment, in the way that meant the stillness was doing a great deal of work. She's coming, Clara said. To Bozeman? Clara picked the letter up and read a section aloud. Her voice was careful. I've thought about what I owe you, Miss Bennett, and I've thought about what I owe myself and my daughter, and I've decided they are the same thing. I don't want my daughter to grow up believing that fear is a good enough reason to stay silent when someone was wronged. I'll be in Bozeman. I can't testify to the letter. But I saw the ledger, I saw the entry, and I'll say so. Clara lowered the letter. She's bringing her daughter. Nathan was quiet. She changed her mind, he said. She did. Clara set the letter on the table. You know what changed it? He shook his head. The dress. Clara looked up at him with something in her eyes that was complicated and warm and very nearly broken open. Beth Henderson's wedding was reported in the Millfield paper. A small notice Beth's family has connections there. The notice mentioned the seamstress by name. Lucy recognized it. Clara paused. She said she'd been told I was destitute and broken, and that fighting Hargrove had ruined me completely. She said seeing my name in a wedding notice, seeing that I'd made something, built something, that was what made her believe we could actually win. Nathan sat down across from her. Sometimes, he said slowly, the things you don't do for strategy are the things that matter most. Clara looked at him. You didn't build the ramp to the porch for strategy either. No, he said. I built it 'cause you were here. She held his gaze, Nathan. Her voice was quiet. I want to ask you something and I need you to answer honestly. All right, when this is over, when the hearings is done and whatever happens happens, what do you want? She held his gaze without wavering. Not what you think is right. Not what you've decided you should want. What do you actually want? Nathan Cole sat across from the woman who had arrived on his porch in a storm 3 months ago with a canvas bag and a look that could have belonged to a person who'd already given up, and he thought about the question. He took his time with it because she deserved his actual answer, not the first one that was easy to say. I want you to stay, he said. Not because you have nowhere else to go. You have somewhere else now. If you want it, you have a name in this town and work, and Aldridge would help you set up anywhere. He held her gaze. I want you to stay because this house is different with you in it. I'm different with you in it, and I am not interested in going back to the way things were before I open that door. Clara looked at him. She looked at him for a long time. That's a large thing to say, she said. It's the accurate thing, he said. I said I'd answer honestly. She was quiet. He waited. I'm going to tell you something, she said finally. And I need you to hear it all the way through before you respond. All right, when I was in Millfield, before the accident, I used to think about what kind of life I wanted, and I had this very clear idea. A place that felt like mine. People who knew my name and meant well by it. She paused. I thought for a long time after the accident that all of that was gone. That what happened to my legs had also happened to that future, that the version of me who could have those things had fallen with the railing. She looked at her hands. I know now that isn't true. I know I can have those things. I've been building them here, in this town, with these people. With you. She looked up at him. But I need to finish this first. I need to go to Bozeman and sit across from Edmund Hargrove and say what I have to say, and I need it to be heard. And then, she paused, and then I want to talk about staying. Then, we go to Bozeman, he said. And then we talk about staying. They left for Bozeman on a Monday morning, Nathan and Clara, Aldridge and his junior clerk, Silas and Dutch and Morse. All of them loaded into 2 wagons in the early cold, with enough provisions for the 4-day journey and the 3-day hearing and whatever came after. Roy Cutler stood at the edge of his property as they passed and lifted his hat. Beth Henderson came to the road with her new husband and pressed a package into Clara's hands, food for the journey, wrapped in cloth and tied with a ribbon that matched the color of the wedding dress. Margaret Albright said nothing, but she stood on the main street of Harlow's Creek and watched the wagons go with the expression of a woman who had made a bet and was confident in the odds. Eliza Marsh was not there, but 3 of the women from Eliza's prayer circle were. They stood together near the dry goods store, and they didn't wave, but they watched. And their faces, Clara noted as she passed, were not hostile. They were something more complicated than hostile. They were the faces of women who hadn't yet decided what they thought, which was different from having decided wrongly, and which left room for things to change. Clara sat in the wagon beside Nathan as Harlow's Creek fell behind them, and she held Beth Henderson's package in her lap, and she thought about what she was riding toward. Hargrove. The courtroom. The moment she would have to be what she'd been practicing to be for 2 years, without knowing she was practicing clear and precise and unbreakable, in the way that was not the absence of damage, but the refusal to be defined by it. "You're quiet," Nathan said. "About Bozeman?" "About what I'm going to say." She looked at the road ahead. "I know what the law needs from me, the facts, the sequence, the document. I know how to give Aldridge what he needs." She paused. "But I keep thinking about what I want to say, what I actually want Hargrove to hear." She was quiet for a moment. "I don't want him to feel sorry for me. I don't want his guilt. I want him to understand that what he took from me, the years, the towns, the running, none of it ended me." Still here, her voice was level and hard and clear as winter water. "I want him to look at me and see that." Nathan looked at her. He thought about the night she'd knocked on his door. The shaking hands and the hollow eyes and the last thread look of someone who had made one final bid before giving up. He thought about what had happened between that night and this morning, and how many small, deliberate choices it had taken hers and his to get from there to here. "He'll see it," Nathan said. "How do you know?" "Because everyone who looks at you sees it," he said simply. "You can't help it." Clara looked at him. Something moved through her expression, that crack again, that fault line in the thing she'd spent 2 years sealing. But this time she didn't look away from it. This time she let it be there, in the full light of a Montana morning with witnesses. "Don't say things like that," she said. But she said it softly and without meaning it. "You told me to answer honestly. I did." She looked back at the road. "I did say that." They rode through the morning in a quiet that was not empty, but full of everything that had been said and everything that was coming, and the particular quality of two people who had stopped pretending they didn't know what they were to each other, and were still figuring out what to do with the knowing. The mountains were ahead of them. Bozeman was 4 days away. Edmund Hargrove was waiting, whether he wanted to be or not. And Clara Bennett, seated in a wagon on a Montana road with a Cantas bag at her feet and a man beside her who had taught her slowly, stubbornly, by example rather than declaration, that some people were worth the risk of staying, was not afraid. She was ready. Bozeman was larger than Harlow's Creek by a factor that made the difference feel almost rude. Clara felt it the moment the wagon rolled into the main street, the volume of it, the density of people and horses and noise and commerce, all moving at once without the particular intimacy of a place where everyone knew your name. She had not been in a city of any size since Millfield, and Millfield felt like a lifetime ago. She sat straight in the wagon seat beside Nathan, and watched the town move around her, and told herself that the tightening in her chest was just the travel, just the cold, just the ordinary adjustment of arriving somewhere new. She didn't entirely believe herself. "All right," Nathan said quietly, "just for her." "Fine," she said, just as quietly. He didn't push. He never pushed. It was one of the things she had come to rely on in him, the understanding that sometimes fine was not the whole truth, but it was the truth a person needed to inhabit for the moment. And that a good man recognized the difference between a lie and a necessary foothold. They found rooms at a boarding house 2 streets from the courthouse. Aldridge had arranged it in advance. The kind of practical preparation that Clara had come to understand was simply how he operated. She and Nathan took rooms across the hall from each other. Silas and Dutch were down the corridor. Morse had stayed at a different establishment, slightly apart, which Clara thought was probably wise. He was still Hargrove's man on paper, still employed, still in a professional position that required careful management even now. Lucy Carr was already there. Clara found her in the boarding house parlor that first evening, a small woman, late 30s, with a child of maybe 5 on her knee, and the particular look of someone who had been bracing for this moment for the last 2 weeks of travel, and was still bracing. She stood when she saw Clara. The child, a girl with dark braids, slid off her knee and stood solemnly beside her mother. "Miss Bennett." "Mrs. Carr." Clara crossed the room. They looked at each other, two women who had inhabited the same household, the same complicated loyalties, the same event that had broken one of them open and frightened the other into silence. "Thank you for coming. I should have come sooner," Lucy said. "I should have. There were so many times I thought about writing. About finding you." Her voice was steady, but the effort of keeping it that way was visible. "I kept telling myself it wasn't my place, that I had nothing certain to add. That you were probably—" She stopped. "I was afraid," she said finally. "Just afraid. I was afraid too." For a long tat her. What changed? Clara thought about a storm, a porch, a man who stepped aside from a doorway without asking what she deserved. "Someone opened a door," she said. The hearing began on a Wednesday morning. The courtroom in Bozeman was nothing like the intimate, complicated space of Harlow's Creek, where everyone knew the bailiff's wife and half the jury would have opinions formed before the first witness spoke. This was a formal room with high ceilings and the smell of old wood and authority, and when Clara wheeled herself through the main door, she felt the weight of it, the specific gravity of a place where things were decided. Edmund Hargrove was already seated at the opposing table. She had not seen him in 2 years. She had thought about this moment, had rehearsed it in her mind, managed her expectations of it, told herself it would be fine and she would be fine, and seeing him would not do anything unexpected to her. She had been wrong about that, and she understood she'd been wrong in the first second her eyes found him across the room. He was older than she remembered. Not dramatically, 2 years was not so long, but he had the look of a man who had been under sustained pressure, which Clara found she did not entirely dislike noticing. He was well dressed, his lawyers arranged on either side of him like a wall, and he sat with the particular stillness of a man who had decided on his demeanor in advance and was executing it with precision. He did not look at her when she came in. She looked at him. She looked at him for a long, steady moment, and she waited until the looking stopped costing her anything significant. Then she turned her chair toward the plaintiff's table, where Aldridge stood arranging his papers, and she went to take her place. Nathan settled into the seat directly behind her in the gallery. She felt him, there felt the specific quality of his attention, the steadiness of it, the way you felt a source of warmth in a cold room. She was not alone. She had not been alone for 3 months. She was still getting used to that. Aldridge opened with the documents. He was methodical and quiet in the way that quiet men were sometimes more devastating than loud ones, building his case not with drama but with precision, each piece placed carefully beside the last until the structure became undeniable. The letter first. Then the ledger, its pages turned to page 43, with Hargrove's own initials there in the exact place they should not be. Then Dutch's copy of the maintenance report, the same date, the same handwriting. The signature of a man who had been a grounds worker and had done his job and had kept a single page for 2 years for reasons he could not entirely explain and which turned out to matter enormously. Hargrove's lawyers objected to the ledger's provenance. Aldridge produced Gerald Morse, who explained the voluntary disclosure in the precise, even voice of a man who had made peace with what he was doing and was not going to be rattled out of that peace by aggressive questioning. The judge listened and sustained Aldridge's position. The ledger stayed. Then Silas Drum took the stand. Silas was not a dramatic man. He was not a man who reached for words that were larger than what he meant. He told what he had seen, in the order he had seen it, in the flat, factual voice of someone who had written it all down 2 years ago precisely so that he would remember it exactly, and exactly was what he intended to deliver. He was on the stand for nearly 2 hours. Hargrove's lawyers worked him from 3 different angles, looking for inconsistency, looking for uncertainty, finding neither. When he stepped down, Dutch went up. Dutch, unlike Silas, was a man who had not yet fully processed the guilt he was carrying, and it showed not in his testimony, which was as solid as Silas's, but in the way he held himself on the stand. Wound tight, careful. Every answer precise because he was afraid of what came out if he let anything be imprecise. He identified his handwriting on the maintenance report. He confirmed the date. He confirmed that he had filed it through the proper channel and received no response. Hargrove's lawyer asked him why he'd kept a personal copy. "My father taught me to keep a copy of everything I signed my name to," Dutch said. "For what purpose?" Dutch looked at the lawyer with the patient, direct eyes of a man who had been asked a question with an obvious answer. "So there'd be a record," he said, "in case the other one got lost." A ripple ran through the courtroom. Hargrove did not react visibly. His lawyers did not react visibly. But something changed in the room's atmosphere in that moment, something tipping in a direction that once established would not easily reverse. Lucy Carr was the last witness of the second day. She sat in the chair with her hands clasped in her lap, and her spine straight, and her voice when it came quieter than Clara had expected but clear. She described her role in the Hargrove household. She described her access to the financial records in the course of her work. She described seeing the maintenance ledger, specifically the entry on page 43 during a routine accounting review. "In your observation," Aldridge said, "did that entry indicate that a maintenance report regarding a railing on the property had been received?" "Yes." "And did it indicate that the report had been reviewed?" "Yes." "And what did the entry indicate regarding action taken on that report?" Lucy's hands tightened slightly in her lap. It indicated that no action was taken. The repair was declined. The initials on the entry were E. H. She paused. Edmund Hargrove. The silence in the courtroom was absolute. Then Hargrove's lawyer rose and the cross-examination began, and it was not gentle. He questioned her memory, her vantage point, her professional capacity to interpret financial entries, her motivations for coming forward after 2 years of silence. Lucy answered each question with the steadiness of a woman who had made her decision and was not going to be argued out of it now. When the lawyer suggested that she was biased in favor of the plaintiff, Lucy looked at him with an expression that Clara, watching from the plaintiff's table, recognized. It was the expression of a woman who was done being managed. "I'm biased in favor of the truth," Lucy said. "I saw what I saw. I recorded what I know. If that creates a bias, then I'll carry it." Clara testified on the morning of the third day. She had thought about this moment more than any other, had rehearsed it, had anticipated it, had gone over it so many times in her mind that she was afraid she'd worn a groove in it that would feel mechanical when the time came. She had worried about crying, about losing her composure, about Hargrove's lawyers finding the angle she hadn't defended. None of those things happened. What happened was that she sat in the witness chair in a Bozeman courtroom with her hands in her lap and her back straight, and she told the truth. She told it simply and in order, the way she'd learned to do everything with precision, without waste, with total attention to what actually mattered and a deliberate setting aside of everything that didn't. She described the accident. She described finding the letter. She described what it meant and what she'd understood and what she'd done. She described the 2 years afterward not in a way designed to produce sympathy, but in a way that was factually complete, because the facts themselves were damning enough without embellishment. Hargrove's lawyer rose for cross-examination and spent 40 minutes attempting to asphalt that she had stolen the letter, that she had dismissed for cause from the Hargrove household, that she had a pattern of making accusations against employers, that her motivations were financial rather than principled. Clara answered each line of questioning with the same calm, measured voice she used when explaining a seam to a new customer. She did not become defensive. She did not become emotional. She did not give him the reaction he was trying to produce. After the lawyer sat down, Aldridge rose for one follow-up question. "Miss Bennett," he said, "the letter you found in Mr. Hargrove's files. Can you describe in your own words what it established?" Clara looked at the judge. "It established," she said, "that Edmund Hargrove knew for 3 months that the railing I fell from was unsafe. It established that he chose not to repair it. It established that when I fell and lost the use of my legs, he knew exactly why it happened and chose to say nothing. And then he chose to destroy my reputation rather than admit what he had done." She paused. "That is what the letter established. The ledger confirms it. The witnesses confirm it. I have been carrying this for 2 years because I had no power and no one willing to stand beside me. Now I do. She said it without anger, without performance. Just fact delivered in a voice that had no give left in it. Edmund Hargrove took the stand on the afternoon of the third day, and he was good. Clara had known he would be. He was a man who had been managing his public face for decades, and he sat in the witness chair with the air of a man who was there voluntarily, who had nothing to hide, who was prepared to be reasonable about a situation that had been regrettably misrepresented. He acknowledged the maintenance reports. He said he had reviewed them. He said he had judged, in his professional capacity as the property owner, that the railing required monitoring but not immediate replacement, and that this judgment had been made in good faith based on the information available to him at the time. He said that what had happened to Miss Bennet was a tragedy he had deeply regretted. He said that his subsequent decisions regarding her employment had been made out of practical necessity, not malice. He was smooth. He was credible. He looked at the judge with the frank, direct gaze of a man telling the truth. Clara watched him and felt something cold move through her chest. Then Aldridge rose. He said pleasantly, "You've testified that your decision not to repair the railing was a matter of good faith professional judgment." "That's correct. And you've testified that this judgment was based on the information available to you." "Yes. The maintenance ledger entered into evidence shows 2 separate reports. The first dated March the 8th, the second dated March 22nd. Aldridge paused. "Can you explain why, having received the second report on the same hazard within 2 weeks of the first, you still did not authorize repair?" A pause, slight, barely perceptible. "As I said, I judged that monitoring was sufficient." A second report, Mr. Hargrove, typically indicates escalating concern from the workers in the field. Does it not? Not necessarily. The man who filed both reports is present in this courtroom. Aldridge gestured toward Dutch, who sat in the gallery with his arms folded and his face steady. He has testified that he filed the second report because he believed the situation had become urgent. You received that report. You initialed it, and you did not repair the railing. Aldridge let the silence sit. 2 weeks after the second report, Miss Bennet fell. Hargrove's lawyer objected. The judge overruled. "Hargrove," Aldridge said, "did you, at any point after Miss Bennet's accident, inform her or anyone else that 2 maintenance reports had been received and declined before her fall?" The silence this time was longer. "I did not believe that information was relevant to." "Did you inform anyone?" "No." "Did you inform Miss Bennet's physicians, who might have wished to know the full context of her accident?" "No." "Did you inform the county office, which maintains records of industrial accidents on private properties?" "No." "Did you inform anyone at all?" Hargrove's voice, when it came, had lost its earlier smoothness by a fraction. Just a fraction. But Clara heard it. She heard the specific quality of a carefully constructed position beginning to show its edge. "No," he said. Aldridge nodded slowly. "Thank you, Mr. Hargrove," he said. "No further questions." The judge's deliberation took until the following morning. None of them slept well. Clara lay in her room at the boarding house and listened to Bozeman at night, the sounds of a city that didn't stop the way Harlow's Creek stopped, that kept moving and breathing and conducting its business through the dark, and she thought about what she would feel if it went wrong. She tried to be honest with herself about it. The evidence was strong. Aldridge believed they would prevail, but courts and money and powerful men had complicated relationships with each other, and she had learned not to assume that right made a guarantee. She thought about what she would do if the verdict went in Hargrove's favor. She thought about it for a long time. And what she found when she looked honestly was that even in the worst case, even if tomorrow brought the wrong answer, she was not the person who had pushed through the mud toward a single light in a Montana storm. She was not the person who had arrived at a strangeman's door with a canvas bag and the last fraying thread of will. That person had been fighting alone and running out of road. This person had witnesses and a lawyer and a town and a man in the next room who had stood at his own gate and said, "Your fight is mine." Even in the worst case, she was not alone. It would be enough to try again. She hoped she wouldn't have to. Nathan knocked on her door at 6 in the morning. She opened it, and he was standing in the corridor with 2 cups of coffee from the boarding house kitchen, and he looked at her with those steady, direct eyes that she had stopped being able to look at, without feeling something she no longer tried to suppress. "How'd you sleep?" "Much." "Me neither." He handed her a cup. "Aldridge thinks by mid-morning." "I know." She wrapped both hands around the cup. "Nathan." "Yeah, whatever happens, to know that what you did she stopped. Started again coming with me. Standing at that gate. Riding to Bozeman, all of it." She looked at him. "You didn't owe me any of it." "Clara, I know. I know you're going to say you did it because it was right or because it was your fight too." She held his gaze. "But it mattered. It mattered to me specifically. And I need you to know that before we go in there. In case I don't." She stopped. Pressed her lips together. "I'm not good at saying these things." "You're doing fine," he said quietly. "I care about you," she said. Flatly and without decoration, because that was the only way she knew how to say the things that mattered. "More than I intended to when I knocked on your door. More than I've let myself care about anyone since the accident. And I don't know what that means yet in terms of what happens after today, but I needed to say it before we go in there." Nathan looked at her. He was quiet for a moment, not the uncertain quiet of a man who didn't know what to say, but the deliberate quiet of a man who understood the weight of what he was about to say and wanted to carry it properly. "I know," he said. "I've known for a while." He held her gaze. "And when this is done, we're going to go home and figure out what it means. Together, at whatever pace you need." She looked at him. "Together, that's what I said." She nodded once. Looked down at her coffee. "All right," she said. "Let's go hear what the man has to say." Judge Pryor read his findings at 10:30 in the morning. Clara sat at the plaintiff's table with her hands in her lap and her eyes on the judge's face, and she listened to the words come careful, legal, precise, and she felt each one land in order. The way you felt notes land when music was building to something. Negligence established. The maintenance records authenticated and admitted. The timeline confirmed. The pattern of conduct documented. "It is the finding of this court," Judge Pryor said, "that the defendant Edmund Hargrove did knowingly fail to address a documented hazardous condition on his property, and that this failure directly and proximately caused the injury sustained by the plaintiff on the date in question. It is further found that the defendant's subsequent conduct, including the dissemination of information damaging to the plaintiff's professional reputation, constituted a deliberate effort to conceal his liability and suppress the plaintiff's ability to seek redress." Clara heard the words. She heard them, and she understood them, and she sat with them for one long moment, letting them be real. Then she heard the number Aldridge had argued for the damages, the formal acknowledgement, the public record that would stand in the court archives and say, in the language of law and therefore in the language of permanence, "Edmund Hargrove did this and it was wrong, and Clara Bennett told the truth." She heard the sound that went through the courtroom. She heard Hargrove's lawyer, speaking in a low, rapid voice at the opposing table. She heard Silas, somewhere behind her, let out a breath that sounded like it had been held for 2 years. She sat very still. Then Nathan's hand came over the gallery railing and settled on her shoulder, and she reached up and put her hand over his and held on. Hargrove did not stay in the courtroom after the verdict. He left with his lawyers in a rapid, contained movement that had the quality of a retreat executed with dignity, the kind of exit a man made when he had lost, but intended to give nothing further away. Clara watched him go from across the room, and she thought about what Aldridge had said. He underestimated what 2 years of having nothing to lose does to a person. He had assumed that a woman in a wheelchair with a destroyed reputation and no money and no standing would eventually stop fighting or die trying, and either outcome would suit him. He had assumed that the letter, if she had it, was useless without corroboration, and that he could buy or threaten or outlast any corroboration that emerged. He had assumed that his money and his name and his network of professional loyalties made him untouchable. He had been wrong on every count, not because Clara was exceptional, though she was. Not because Nathan was exceptional, though he was that too. But because Hargrove had made the oldest mistake of powerful men, he had assumed that the people beneath him had no weight of their own. That they could be set aside without consequence. That a woman who fell 15 feet and lost the use of her legs and was pushed out into a Montana winter with a canvas bag would stay pushed. She had not stayed pushed. And now his name was in a court record that would not be expunged, and the maintenance ledger sat in evidence, and there were 5 people who had stood up in a formal proceeding and said what they knew, and not one of them had been destroyed by it. Clara looked at the door through which he had gone. "Go on then," she said, very quietly, to the empty space where he'd been. It wasn't triumphant. It wasn't angry. It was just final. The closing of something that had been open and bleeding for 2 years, stitched shut at last, by truth and time, and the stubbornness of people who refused to pretend they hadn't seen what they saw. She turned her chair around. Nathan was there. He came off the gallery step and crossed the floor to her and stopped in front of her, and looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen on his face before, open, unhidden. Everything that was usually carefully maintained behind the steadiness of him fully visible. "It's done," he said. "It's done," she agreed. He crouched down so he was at her eye level, and he looked her directly, and she looked back at him, and there was nothing to manage in it, nothing to protect, nothing to be careful about. Just 2 people who had come through something together, and were standing in whatever way was available to them on the other side. "Let's go home," Nathan said. They rode back to Harlow's Creek over 4 days, and the journey felt nothing like the one going out. Going out had been braced, all of them coiled against what was coming, the uncertainty of it, the fear underneath the determination. Coming back had a different quality. Not relaxed, not entirely, because there was still the matter of what came next, the legal aftermath, the restitution process, Aldridge's continued work. There was still Gerald Morse's uncertain professional future and Lucy Carr's long road back to Butte and Dutch's Wyoming life that needed returning to, and the East Pasture Survey claim that needed formal dismissal. There was still a great deal of ordinary life waiting to be lived. But the quality of it was different. The air between them in the wagon was different. The silences were different, the comfortable kind, the kind that didn't need to be filled. Silas rode beside the wagon most of the second day and talked about his family, his wife and 3 children, the mortgage that was almost paid down, the property he'd been working toward for 7 years. He talked about it with the ease of a man whose life had come back into focus, the way things came back into focus when you finally did the thing you knew you needed to do. "My wife's going to want to meet you," he told Clara. "She's heard about you for 2 years. 2 years is a long time to hear about a person you've never met," Clara said. "She kept your letter. The one you sent asking if I'd testify." He paused. "She said anyone who wrote a letter like that, honest and clear, and not asking for more than what was right, was the kind of person worth going out of your way for." Clara looked at the road ahead. "Tell her thank you," she said, "for lending you to this." Silas was quiet a moment. "She'd say she didn't lend me. She'd say she sent me." He paused. "There's a difference." They were still a day out from Harlow's Creek when Nathan pulled the wagon off the main road at midday to rest the horses at a creek crossing, and Clara stayed in the wagon while the others moved around, making camp for the midday stop. And Nathan came and leaned against the wagon beside her, and they were briefly, for the first time in days, alone. "I've been thinking," Clara said. "About what?" "About what you said. Before the hearing. Going home. Figuring things out together, I remember saying that." "I want to do that." She held his gaze. "I want to stay. Not as your house guest. Not as the woman who's there temporarily while she figures out her next move." She paused. "I want to stay the way people stay when they've decided. Permanently, with all of what that means." Nathan looked at her for a moment. "You sure?" he said. "Nathan." She held his gaze with the direct that was the most essential thing about her, that clear-eyed, unhedged, absolute quality that had survived the accident and the towns and the running, and 2 years of carrying a letter that could destroy a powerful man and hadn't let her destroy herself. I was sure before, Bozeman. I've been sure for a while. I was waiting until this was done because I didn't want anything you said to feel like it was shaped by the circumstances. It wasn't. I know, but I needed to wait. She looked at him. I'm not waiting anymore. Nathan Cole stood beside the wagon on a Montana road with the sound of that creek and the voices of the others somewhere behind them. And he looked at this woman who had knocked on his door in a storm and turned out to be the most important thing to ever walk in whatever way was available to her into his life. And he said, "Good. Because I've been done waiting for a while too." He reached up and took her hand. She held it. Not a dramatic gesture. Not that kind of moment that announced itself with music or weather or the convenient arrangement of light. Just a man's hand and a woman's, and the quiet decision of two people who had earned each other the hard way. It was enough. It was in every way that mattered. More than enough. Harlow's Creek received them home on a Thursday afternoon. Roy Cutler was at the edge of his property again, hat in hand, and when Nathan lifted a hand in greeting, Roy nodded with the satisfied expression of a man whose bet had paid out. Margaret Albright was in front of the dry goods store, and she looked at Clara with a direct, approving nod that Clara returned. Beth Henderson's new husband was at the livery, and he raised his hat with the wide, genuine smile of a young man who understood that something good had happened and was glad to be adjacent to it. Eliza Marsh was not there. She had not been there when they left, and she was not there when they returned, and Clara thought that was probably how it would be for a while, and that was fine. Some minds change quickly. Some minds change slowly. Some minds did not change, and you lived alongside them anyway, and that was the ordinary texture of community, which was not a perfect thing but was the thing you had. What was there, what Clara noticed and what stayed with her, was a small group of women standing together on the wooden sidewalk outside the seamstress supply shop. 3 of them, none of whom she knew well, none of whom had been particularly warm to her in the months before. They stood and watched the wagons come in, and when Clara passed, the one in the middle, a woman whose name Clara had never learned, looked at her directly and nodded. A single, simple public nod. It was not an apology. It was not a declaration. It was just an acknowledgement. You are here, I see you, and in the small economy of how towns change their minds about people, it was the beginning of something. She would take it. The ranch looked the same as when they'd left. Of course it looked the same. It had been 9 days, not 9 years, but Clara felt the sameness differently than she'd expected to. She felt it as arrival, which was different from the feeling of returning somewhere temporary. She came through the door, and the kitchen was the same kitchen, and the sewing room was the same sewing room, and the cedar-smelling spare room was the spare room. She stopped in the hall outside it. Nathan came in behind her and stopped when she did. "That room," she said. "What about it? It's been the spare room for 3 months. "It has." She turned to look at him. "I think it might be time to call it something else." Nathan looked at her for a moment. Then the corner of his mouth moved that almost smile she'd spent 3 months learning to read. "I think you're right," he said. 6 months after the night a storm sent Clara Bennett to Nathan Cole's door, the workshop opened on the main street of Harlow's Creek. It was a small storefront, rented from the building that had previously been a dry goods annex, with a long workbench along one wall and 2 sewing stations, and a counter where customers could bring their orders. Nathan had built the interior himself, with the same deliberate, unpretentious care he brought to everything: the threshold flush to the floor, the shelves at heights that required no impossible reach, the work surfaces designed for someone who did her best work from a seated position. He had not asked her if she wanted these things. He had asked her what she needed, and she had told him, and he had built exactly that. On the day the workshop opened, Margaret Albright came first and stayed 2 hours and left a substantial order. Beth Henderson brought her mother and her new sister-in-law. 3 women Clara had never met came in, because they'd heard about the Henderson wedding dress from women who'd heard about it, from women who'd been there. And Eliza Marsh came at the end of the day, alone, without announcement. She stood in the doorway and looked at the space, and looked at Clara and said nothing for a moment. Clara waited. "My granddaughter is getting married in the spring," Eliza Marsh said finally. Her voice was stiff with the effort of what she was doing, and she was making no attempt to hide that effort, which Clara found she respected more than she would have respected a performance of graciousness. "I was told your work is exceptional." "It is," Clara said. Eliza's mouth tightened slightly. Then she said, "I'd like to discuss the dress." Clara gestured to the chair across from her work table. "Sit down, Mrs. Marsh," she said, "and tell me what your granddaughter loves." That evening, Nathan found her still at the work table, long after the last customer had gone. He came in without knocking. They had stopped knocking. That had happened somewhere around the second month, and neither of them had remarked on it. He set cups of coffee on the table and sat across from her, the way he'd been sitting across from her since the first morning after the storm. "How was it?" he said. "Good." She set down the measuring tape she'd been working with. Eliza Marsh came. Nathan's eyebrows rose fractionally. "She wants a wedding dress for her granddaughter," Clara said. "And you took the order." "Of course I took the order." She looked at him. "I'm not in the business of refusing work to people who've changed their minds. That's a luxury I can't afford and wouldn't want even if I could." She paused. "Besides, it means something when someone who's been against you comes through the door." "It does," Nathan agreed. "It means the thing we built is real enough to matter to them." "The thing you built," he said. She shook her head. "The thing we built," she said firmly. "I know what I did. I know what you did. They're not the same, and we don't have to pretend they are to give me equal credit." She looked at him across the table. "You opened a door. I walked through it. What came after took both of us." Nathan looked at, he said, "The thing we built." She nodded, picked up her coffee. Outside, Harlow's Creek was settling into the particular quiet of a small Montana town at the end of an ordinary day. Lamps coming on, horses being led to water, the distant clang of the blacksmith finishing up. The ordinary, unremarkable, infinitely sustaining business of a community going about its life. Inside the workshop on the main street, the workshop with the flush threshold and the well-placed shelves and the 2 sewing stations and the counter where orders were taken and honored a woman with a needle-calloused hand and a spine that had never bent to the thing that tried to break her, sat across from the man who had taught her, by example rather than declaration, that surviving alone was not the same as living. She had come to his door with nothing. They had built something that would outlast the storm that brought her there. The woman in the wheelchair had never needed someone to carry her through the world. She had needed someone willing to stand beside her while she moved through it on her own terms. And the lonely cowboy who'd opened his door in the dark had discovered, at 38 years old on 12 acres of Montana rock, the one true thing he'd been missing all along. That a home was not a thing you built from wood and will and solitary years. A home was built from the person who chose to stay. And she had chosen, and he had chosen. And that all of that, every storm-soaked mile and document and courtroom and late-night cup of coffee and hand held in the dark was exactly, and completely, and permanently enough.